Nations. And I'd like you to join me in expressing our deepest respect and gratitude for the First Nations people for their enduring care and protection of our shared lands and waterways. And I'd like to open this session as well by just having a few words about, as you are, I'm sure, quite well aware, over the last number of weeks and months, our commissioners have been meeting probably about 7 times, I would say, John, give or take. We've had some really, I think, critical discussions over those 7 meetings that have really identified the core areas that we need to focus upon. And at the same time, I would say that we also started out those discussions with agreement around some general principles that would focus our discussions and negotiations. So while we have not concluded those, we will be carrying those on to reach an agreement for a longer term. And I look forward to those discussions continuing over the coming weeks. I'll turn to my counterpart, John, and see if he had other opening comments that he wished to make.
Thank you, Paul, and thanks to the Canadian delegation for hosting this year. It's an honor for me to be here, not only to be in the lovely city of Victoria, but also an honor for me to be attending my first annual meeting of the Halibut Commission. I have been in my role as Alaska Regional Administrator for NOAA Fisheries for just about 10 months, but with the agency for a long time and used to dealing with a lot of challenging marine resource issues. But it's been fun to learn more about the Halibut Commission and its operations. With regard to the negotiations overview that Paul mentioned, I think we've made some really good progress over the past several months. And although we haven't yet reached agreement on a long-term approach, we've laid some really good groundwork, and I think both sides are open to continuing that dialogue. So look forward to continuing those discussions.
Thanks very much, John. And with that, I have no changes to the agenda, John. I'll just check with you and see if you have any.
I do not.
So with that, Dave, I'm going to turn it over to you. You're going to provide us a number of presentations, starting off with the update on actions arising from the 98th session of the annual meeting.
Well, thank you very much, Chair. And as you say, it's good to be back in-person meetings of the Halibut Commission. So looking forward to a fruitful series of discussions over the coming week and seeing where the Secretariat can help service the Commission as necessary. And as part of that, we do have, as you say, a number of process papers. They're not going to be very lengthy, but we'd just like to give you an overview of what's been happening over the last year since the last annual meeting. And as a function of that, we have agenda item 3.1 and paper 03, which is an update on the actions arising from the last annual meeting held virtually in January of 2022. But then also in terms of other updates from the special session, which was held in early 2022, and as detailed in Appendix B. And then finally also to provide some additional update on what the Secretariat's been doing and the Commission as well to complete the actions arising from the 98th interim meeting held this recent November. I'm very pleased to say that all of the actions arising from the 98th session of the Commission, the 12th special session, and also the intersessional decision, and then finally the 98th session of the interim meeting have all been completed. So the various appendices, A, B, and C of this paper provide an indication of where we have taken steps to implement those actions, how they've been completed, and usually providing links to material that's actually going to be presented to you over the course of this week. And so I don't intend on stepping through all of those in detail, but simply to request that the Commission note those actions arising as outlined in paper 3 and which they have all been completed. So I'll pause there, Chair.
Thanks very much, Dave. I don't think we have any questions at this point, so I think we can carry on.
Perfect. Thank you very much. So if we could have the presentation for paper 04, please. It is loud, isn't it? Just commenting that the exhaust fan or intake fan is extremely loud up the front here. So if you continue to have issues hearing us, please just let us know. And we might be able to put a pause on that for a little while. So while that presentation for paper 04 is brought up, I'll just talk in general terms to it. It is the report of the Secretariat on additional activities not covered in papers being presented to you over the coming days. The report details a number of actions that we've been undertaking, both in terms of research, in terms of collaboration, and then also a couple of other endeavors, including the IPHC Scholarship Award. And now that it's up, I'll step through it. And then also what we've been doing from a fisheries policy perspective. And so I'll just spend a little bit of time walking through those for you. The IPHC Secretariat consists of 34 full-time positions, although we do have one of those that we are not going to fund moving forward. We have, on average, 35 to 45 temporary or seasonal positions, and those positions compose both the up to 10 fisheries data specialists that we staff ports coast-wide to collect data on Pacific halibut from the commercial fleet as they land their catch. And then the remainder are those who staff our fishery independent setline survey vessels as part of the annual FIS run each year. Our shared vision at the Secretariat is to deliver not only positive economic, but also environmental and social outcomes for the Pacific halibut resource for Canada and the US. And we do this through the application of rigorous science. And you're going to hear from a number of our lead scientists this afternoon in particular, but also a little bit tomorrow morning about the work that they've been undertaking to service the Commission's needs. I am very pleased to indicate that we had a very successful internship this past year with Vasily and Caitlin both contributing to the work that you're going to hear a little bit more about from Dr. Planis, I think tomorrow morning, associated with the Biological and Ecosystem Science branch. Vasilia is from the Pacific Lutheran University in Tacoma, Washington, and Caitlin came across from Vermont, from Amherst University. In 2022, we also ran our IPHC Merit Scholarship, and I'd like to thank greatly the selection panel of our 5 panelists, consisting of 2 commissioners, Commissioner Alverson and Commissioner de Grief, as well as Angel Drobnica and Patrick DePoe and Krista Russell, who also sat on the panel, and helped us work through a very competitive set of applications for our IPHC Merit Scholarship. As part of that, I'd like to just congratulate once again publicly Lucy Hankins, who's based in Seward, Alaska, who was the successful recipient of the IPHC scholarship. And she'll receive that scholarship for the next 4 years while she's successfully completing her degree. Also like to highlight that our existing recipient, Halen Benken-Bakau, has another 2 years on his scholarship. And we hope to hear a little bit from him once he completes his degree. The meetings of the Commission have slowly transitioned to be back in person. And so while we started the year fully virtual at the Finance Administration Committee, an annual meeting series in January, throughout the course of the year, we moved the Scientific Review Board and then also the work meeting and to be held in either a hybrid format or in person, and up to where we are at this point. In terms of fishery regulations, I'd like to pass to Dr. Hutchinazak, who's going to walk you through a few updates. Over to you, Basha.
Thank you. In terms of regulatory proposals that were adopted in the 2021-2022 process, the Commission adopted 7 of them. 6 of them were adopted at the 98th session of the annual meeting, and 1 later at the special session 12. 1 proposal was deferred, and we will return to this proposal tomorrow in the agenda item number 8. All these regulatory changes that were adopted by the Commission were brought for formal approval and implementations by both contracting parties. In terms of interactions with contracting parties, I will summarize a couple of most important ones. On the Canadian side, in May 2022, the Archipelago Management Board approved the application the DFO put forward to permit multi-year approvals for Fisheries Independent Setlines Survey in Guayana's National Marine Conservation Area. This permit approval is now valid until 2024. The Secretariat is also actively participating in Halibut Advisory Board, or HAB. On the U.S. side, the Secretariat is also closely following actions of the relevant council meetings. In November 2020, the Pacific Fishery Management Council took final action on the 2A fishery management transition to NOAA fisheries, and the resulting final rule was published on 5th of December last year. This rule is now effective from 4th of January, and accordingly, NIMS will be responsible for issuing permits for 2A fisheries and also management of the 2A non-tribal directed commercial fishery beginning from 2023. Annual management alternatives for the IPHC Regulatory Area 2A will be now considered through the council process in September and November. This will be happening together with the catch sharing plan. More details on this activity and this action can be found in the IPHC information paper 3 that includes our outreach note. I will also note that the NOAA website with the application for permits for 2A is now live, and we encourage all our stakeholders to familiarize themselves with this new process of applying for 2A permits through NOAA fisheries. In February 2022, the North Pacific Fishery Management Council adopted the purpose and needs statement and set of alternatives for analysis of Pacific halibut capturing plan allocations between the charter sector and the commercial sector in Alaska. Another action relevant to Pacific halibut is from April 2022, when the Council took final action on establishing a fee collection program for charter vessel operators to fund the recreational quota entity. The authority to collect this fee by NOAA Fisheries is now approved through Omnibus Appropriation Bill that was published on December 19, 2022. In April 2022, the North Pacific Fisheries Management Council also adopted several changes to the individual fishing quota program, and this includes clarification that slinky pots are legal gear for IFQ and CDQ fisheries in Alaska. This and a couple of other interactions with contracting parties can be found in the information in the paper 4 of the IPHC Secretariat. And this paper includes various other activities, including also a couple of activities that would potentially overlap with the IPHC Fisheries Independent Setline Survey. A couple of other interactions will be also summarized during the presentation of the FIS and will include the collaborations through the FIS survey. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Basha. In terms of IPHC communications and outreach conducted throughout 2022, noting that it was still transitioning out of the pandemic, we have spent a lot of time looking at the data that we have collected over the years and trying to make it a little bit more accessible, including the water column profiler data, which is collected through the Fishery Independent Setline Survey. And so for those of you who are interested, I do encourage you to access the water column profiler data, which is now freely available on the website. The link you can see on the screen. And I'd also like to thank the team who spent a lot of time ensuring that data was QC'd and then ensuring that now it's publicly available. Throughout the course of 2023, we'll also be working on a number of visualization scenarios for this data, similar to what we already have on the website for the Fishery Independent Setline Survey, the catch data. And so you can look forward to that over the coming year. The annual report also available. We are currently working on our 2022 annual report, which will obviously complement the 2021 annual report. It's freely available on the website, but we do expect the 2022 report to be out within the next month or so. IPHC circulars and media releases continue to be the primary means that we communicate with broader stakeholder groups and the Commission itself. Throughout the course of 2022, there were 24 circulars detailing the various actions that we are undertaking throughout the year. We also use those circulars to disseminate decisions of the Commission that may have been made intersessionally. And so if you are, for example, interested in tracking intersessional decisions and special sessions of the Commission, you should sign up for access to those circulars so that they get delivered directly to your inbox. Otherwise, they're available freely on the website as well. We continue to be very active in terms of our external engagement, but also through publication of the work that we're undertaking. Our team are on a number of university as affiliate faculty and also graduate student committee members. And I'd just like to highlight Dr. Hicks, Dr. Stewart, Dr. Planas for their continued engagement with higher education institutions, and in particular, the Alaska Pacific University and the University of Washington. Throughout the course of the year, the team has produced 8 peer-reviewed publications, and we have quite a number of others that are in review. Those are available through the document associated with the presentation if you are interested, so I encourage you to do a little bit of research in that regard if you're interested. So, Chair, simply asking the Commission to note Paper 04, which is an update on the activities of the Secretariat throughout 2022.
Yeah, thanks very much, Dave. Any questions for Dave from commissioners? I think you can move on to the next paper, Dave.
Thank you, Chair, and I see you both leaning away from me as I cough. Understandable reaction. So if I could have the latest presentation for the next paper, please, which is agenda item 3.3 and is the second performance review of the IPHC and the implementation of the recommendations. So I'm not going to spend too much time as background. This is a paper that we present to the interim meeting and also the annual meeting each year. And it just outlines the actions that the IPHC more broadly, which includes the Secretariat, has undertaken over the last year in terms of the implementation of the performance review recommendations. We have added a status table as a cover to this paper, which very quickly gives you an indication of the overall status of the implementation of the 26 recommendations that arose from that performance review. At this point, we have 17 that have been completed and or annually ongoing. We have 6 that are in progress, 2 pending, and 1 on hold. And so I'll just step through some of those that are a work in progress. In terms of recommendations that are on hold, the legal analysis of the convention is going to be deferred at this point, probably until further discussion at the 3rd performance review of the IPHC. In terms of performance review recommendations that remain pending, we have the recommendation 13 and 14, both related to compliance and enforcement, where the contracting parties at this stage are providing annual updates as through their national reports. And we'll hear a little bit more from the contracting parties when those national reports are discussed later this week. I've just lost control of the mouse. If you could advance, that would help me. Great, Secretariat. Here we go. So you could just jump back one. Perfect. Thank you very much. In terms of the recommendations that are currently underway, so we have made some progress, but they're not yet completed. As I said, there are 6 of those, the first being recommendation 15. And this relates to what Dr. Hutchinson was just talking about, the transition into a management to domestic fisheries managers. And so that's going to be spoken about a little bit later. We do have paper 14, which will provide you some more context surrounding how those fishery regulations need to be modified to accommodate that transition. Recommendations 21 and 22 relate to cooperation with other organizations, and this is primarily surrounding engagement with other countries who are not currently contracting parties to the convention who interact with Pacific halibut in their fisheries. And those three countries related to the Western Pacific are Japan, Korea, and Russia. We are limiting our current engagement with those parties through PICES as a scientific exchange platform for sharing information. And Dr. Plantis will talk a little bit about some of that work that's ongoing, particularly related to understanding the migration patterns of Pacific halibut. And I either skipped over one or that is it. No, I did skip over one. And so, in addition, we have ongoing recommendations related to observer data. And at this point, we have also provided paper 16, which is just a bit of an information paper for want of a better description, just describing some of the paths that the Commission may wish to take relating to coming up with standardized data collection standards for observers. And so with that, Chair, I'll pause and see if there are any questions.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. Any questions from commissioners? Neil?
I apologize if I missed it. I wondered if there was any more specific updates about the timing of transition for management of 2A fisheries, recommendation number 15.
Thank you very much. Through the chair, I'll ask Dr. Hutchinson to take the microphone. Thank you.
Thank you for the chair. Yes, there will be more discussion about the transition on 2A fisheries management during the agenda item, I believe 8, when we talk about the regulatory proposal, because one of these proposals is very specifically related to this transition.
Any other questions? No, that covers it, Dave.
Thank you very much, Chair. And the mouse did skip this slide, and it's just relating to the management strategy evaluation work, which is ongoing. And you're going to hear from Dr. Hicks later this week to provide a very clear update on where we're at. So I'm just going to pause at that point and ask the Secretariat to bring up the next presentation for agenda item 3.4, please. Thank you very much. So this relates to paper 6, and the intention here is just to provide you with a brief update on the implementation of the new 5-year program of integrated research and monitoring. And so this is running from 2022 through to 2026. So one of the overarching goals of our 5-year program of integrated research and monitoring is to promote the integration and synergies among the various research and monitoring activities at the Secretariat. The previous 5-year plan, which ended at the start of 2022, was focused primarily on the biological and ecosystem science components of the work at the Secretariat. And so this is the first fully integrated plan that we have developed and have commenced implementing for the Commission's needs. Primary inputs that we try and seek is to improve both the Pacific halibut stock assessment, and again that you'll hear from Dr. Stewart later this afternoon, but then also the management strategy evaluation process, where you'll hear from Dr. Hicks. By doing so, we do hope that we're going to be providing the Commission with the best possible scientific information to fulfill its decision-making requirements. Along with the implementation of the short and medium-term activities which are contemplated within the 5-year plan, and I do encourage you to take a review of that if you are interested about the scientific activities, The Secretariat also aims to undertake a number of other key tasks, and I don't intend on stepping through these, but just very briefly, it's obviously not only undertaking very applied research, but also theoretical research. We also aim to effectively communicate the outcomes of that research to you as stakeholders, and then the broader public and scientific communities. And we do that in a number of ways, some of which I outlined in the report of the Secretariat. The research and monitoring activities that we do conduct are aimed at fulfilling a number of key objectives. First is our data collection objective for the Commission, and this involves both fishery-dependent data, but then also fishery-independent data as well. So sampling in port, for example, versus via our survey platform, the Fishery-Independent Setline Survey. We also aim, through the work of Dr. Planus, to undertake the core biological and ecological research, and this includes the presentation that you're going to hear from Dr. Planus probably first thing tomorrow morning, including some of the genetic work that he and his team have been undertaking to identify not only the migration paths of Pacific halibut, but then also to identify a couple of other aspects that feed directly into the management strategy evaluation work that you're going to hear about shortly. The other key elements, the stock assessment and management strategy evaluation themselves, are self-explanatory, so I won't spend any time stepping through that. In addition, we do also respond to direct requests from the Commission for management support. An example of that is the size limit analysis that we undertake periodically to service some of the requests for decision by the Commission. The plan itself is structured into 5 key components, both in the paper itself, but then also the presentation. We have provided a number of links that will take you to the website. And the reason for that is that the material that we have in support of the 5-year plan is quite substantial. And so we are not only providing you an overview of our activities within the 5-year plan, but then via the website portal, you're able to go in and look at the research that's currently being undertaken, what we're planning over the coming years, but then also the history of the research for that particular item. In addition, through the monitoring components, you can access our Fishery Independent Setline Survey data, which is being collected throughout the survey and is publicly available on the website. Similarly, also our fishery-dependent data that's being collected through the logbooks and the like. Once it goes through the data confidentiality components, it's also made available on the website. And I do encourage you to explore these various links to have a better idea of some of the broader research that we're undertaking. This schematic, as confusing as it may first appear, makes a lot of sense to us, and it really, again, highlights the core areas that we're undertaking our activities of monitoring, stock assessment and management strategy evaluation, the biological and ecological research, as well as coming up with the basic biological theoretical research that we're undertaking. This is really supported by a number of external components, whether it be external funding for research grants that the team is undertaking, and then also through scientific publications. And the scientific publications are self-fulfilling in a way that they're then used to support the securing of additional external funding through grants and the like. All of this, of course, feeds into our management decision-making through the commissioners themselves. And you'll see the gray box there, which is the management supporting information, such as the ad hoc analysis on size limits and those things, which are not specifically related to research, but is something that the Secretariat provides as a service to the Commission. As part of our annual ongoing review and update of the plan, it is the intention that the plan will be a living document and will be updated annually based on input from our Scientific Review Board, the Research Advisory Board, and of course the Commission itself, where it may decide that resources are better allocated to a different stream of research. We will then be going through and updating the plan accordingly. Each year, again, through the Scientific Review Board and other mechanisms, we will be measuring our success and reporting that out to the Commission. This will be measured in terms of a number of key areas that are highlighted on the screen, such as the timeliness of the research in responding to Commission requests, how accessible we're making those findings, whether it's simply through the Commission subsidiary body process or more broadly through publications in peer-reviewed journal articles, the relevance of the research that we're undertaking, both for the Commission and more broadly for interested stakeholders. The overall impact, is it, for example, actively assisting the Commission to make its decisions, and also if it's being able to be used more broadly for a stakeholder community. So, Chair, at this point, we're simply asking the Commission to note the update on the 5-year program of integrated research and monitoring, and if you so desire, provide any in-year redirection of our activities. And so I'll pass back to you. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks very much, Dave. Questions? Maybe just a comment, Dave. Makes sense to have a living program, but I guess one of the challenges is to, when the new one is posted, is to understand what the changes have been from year to year. And so is there a way of capturing whatever changes there are that you input into the updated program? And I guess similar to the performance review, is there a way of adding a scorecard of how well you're doing as far as making progress on the plan?
Thank you, Chair. In short, yes, certainly for the first component. It's something that, as part of our reporting out through the work meeting, interim meeting, and annual meeting process, will document any changes that have been incorporated into the plan. Most of those will most likely come out of this meeting annually, with the Commission either giving an indication that funding needs to be redirected to a different project, or undertaking additional work, such as a size limit analysis. And so as we report out at those 3 meetings for the Commission, we'll certainly highlight any changes that would potentially be incorporated into the next revision, and then coming next year, the Commission would endorse those changes before it's published. In terms of a scorecard, it's something that we're developing based on those 5 criteria of measuring success. And so what that's exactly going to look like is something in development, but it's certainly very possible, and it's on our radar. Thank you.
All right, thanks very much, Dave. That's good to hear. Any other questions? No, I don't see any others, Dave.
Thank you very much. So moving on to agenda item 3.5, which is the report of the 23rd session of the Research Advisory Board. So if I could just have that report brought up on screen, please. Okay. Thank you very much. And so we don't expect you to read what's on screen. It's just a reference document primarily for myself, but I do encourage you, if you are interested, to see how the Research Advisory Board has undertaken the various activities that it reviewed at its recent meeting. So the Research Advisory Board meeting was held just before the interim meeting this past year. And as a function of their work, they reviewed a number of core areas, but spent a significant amount of time focusing on the Fishery Independent Setline Survey design and implementation for 2023 and beyond. And so as a function of that, the Research Advisory Board has provided a range of advice to the Secretariat on how to improve the Fishery Independent Setline Survey, also about how to engage with stakeholders, amongst also reviewing the research activities. There was only one specific action that arose from the Research Advisory Board meeting, and that was relating to the request from the Alaska Department of Fish and Game to provide 100% of the bycatch revenue to the state of Alaska that was caught and sold associated with the Fishery Independent Setline Survey. So I don't intend on reading through this paragraph in full. It is available for you, but the indication and request from the RAB is very clear that the processing efforts from the crew on the Fishery Independent Setline Survey need to be remunerated in some form, and so there was certainly some commentary surrounding that. But that's all I have on the RAB report, Chair, so I can pause there and see if there's any questions.
Thanks, Dave. Any questions on RAB for Dave? No, not at, oh, Peter.
Yeah, just in reviewing the document, it seemed like there was quite a bit of discussion on the FIS around length of skates. Was there any conclusions drawn by the end of meeting on what would be the appropriate length of a skate for set line survey?
Thank you for the question, Commissioner, and through the chair. Not in terms of length of the skate per se. There was quite a lot more discussion around the number of skates that should be used on each fishery independent set line survey station, with the majority commenting very clearly that there is a strong preference for 6 skates versus 8 skates, primarily from an operational point of view and also in terms of attracting crew to head out on our survey vessels. But in terms of the specific length of each skate, no, there was not a specific conclusion in that regard.
Yeah, sorry, I meant number of skates.
Okay, any other questions? I don't see any, Dave. So we would move on to agenda item 3.6. Who will be reporting out on the Scientific Review Board?
Thanks very much, Chair. And so we do have the Chair of the Scientific Review Board here, Dr. Cox, and there he is. I'll ask him to come up to make a presentation. And so while Dr. Cox is doing that, just a reminder as well that regarding the Fishery Independent Set Line Survey, our Set Line Survey Coordinator, Kayla, and the team will be available this Thursday evening to run through the tenders and the bids for 2023. And we do encourage you to take any thoughts, if you weren't at the Research Advisory Board, to that meeting to comment particularly about the number of skates and other operational improvements that could be made. So we'll advertise that again a little bit more later in the week, but I just wanted to flag it at this point, given the question. So over to you, Dr. Cox.
Thank you. Well, welcome back to in-person SRB reports. We're going to be reporting on our last 2 meetings, one from last September, which typically focuses on the more recent stock assessment, and there's a research meeting that usually occurs in June. Okay, which button moves this forward? Oh, there we go. Okay, well, this is your SRB. We have 3 members at the moment. We're about 1 short of the maximum sustainable SRB limit. Myself, I'm from Simon Fraser University, over across the water in Burnaby, BC. Dr. Scribner is from Michigan State, and Olaf Jensen from the University of Wisconsin. Dr. Scribner specializes in population ecology, life history, a lot of the things that contribute to the biological research program, and Dr. Jensen and myself are more on the stock assessment side. So as I mentioned, the June meeting is typically focused on research, which we did a lot of work on the research plan last year and the MSE, and then in the fall we talk about the FIS, the MSE, and the stock assessment. Next slide. So the usual procedure is to go over the upcoming FIS for 2023. So this was something that we endorsed and provisionally endorsed the upcoming designs for 24 and 25. Next. So this particular one, I haven't gone through all the recommendations and requests that we have in the document. There's a lot of detail in there, but just some of the ones that I thought might be of interest to folks in the meeting here. In particular, there's an area 4B where there's been some difficulty getting survey effort up there. So here we just recommended looking for ways to increase the pool of possible bidders to go out and be able to do that survey. Next. Probably one of the bigger recommendations we had this year was to try to estimate natural mortality in the stock assessment. For years, natural mortality has been fixed. I forget specifically the number. I think it was 16% or something. Most stock assessments of the size and quality of the one that you have for halibut would be estimating natural mortality. Basically because there's a lot of data feeding into the assessment on age composition and survival. And at least it would represent whatever the uncertainty is in natural mortality a bit better than just fixing it to a particular value. So you might see some implications of that in the upcoming assessment information later on. Next. Oh, I was just back one there. Down at the bottom here. We did talk a little bit about marine mammal prevalence in the fishery and its impacts, and some of the reports that are coming in, and it's difficult to say one way or another what to do about it without getting a fairly well-designed study of it. So we're just encouraged further investigation into methods to estimate marine mammal prevalence and impacts on the fishery. So David mentioned a minute ago about visiting the data portals that have been created over the last several years. And we've looked at these, and they're really quite useful. A lot of the kind of communication and data production that's going on at the Secretariat. So we really, the SRB is really encouraged by that. And just recommended here to maybe produce some peer-reviewed data reports so that IPHC gets more credit for this in the scientific world when people are using data. So basically making it more accessible, but also being able to track how much of IPHC's data is being used in various ways in fisheries and ocean sciences. Next. Now to some of the more kind of heavy duty ones. So one of the things that we requested was that the MSC not get into the process of testing the stock synthesis estimation method in the management procedure simulations. So currently, as you'll see, Dr. Stewart uses a software package called Stock Synthesis to do the assessment. And if you're doing an MSE and you're trying to simulate how your management system is working over time, you want to represent how you make decisions and how you do assessments. One option for doing that is to actually embed the stock synthesis into a simulation. And that may make it somewhat more realistic, but it also creates a whole list of headaches and problems that are easily avoided by just using a simpler method. For example, using something that's based on the FIS from year to year. So I'm going to mention something later on about this when it comes to multi-year assessments. So I'll come back to this a bit later. So that was our June meeting. Next. The main thing that we comment or recommendation we had from the 5-year research program is to consider how to fund research, because you can go out and fund it externally through granting organizations and various foundations and wherever, but you can also fund things internally, and in some cases internally funded research is you have a bit more flexibility over how it's done and how it's managed. Typically, when you get externally funded research through a granting agency, you have to follow your proposal almost to the letter to get the money. Whereas internally funded work, you can be a bit more flexible in how you carry it out. Another recommendation here down at the bottom, metrics to include in the management strategy evaluation performance measures. One is, if one of the things that seems to be emerging is possibly multi-year assessments. So doing an assessment every so many years, 3 years, say, and using some other simple procedure in between those assessments to actually make the TCEY decisions. Can you just go back a sec? Back one? So we're recommending here that a good metric would be what happens to the TCEY adjustment in years when you do a full stock assessment, when you implement that stock synthesis update. Okay, next. As many people may realize, there's been some genetic work ongoing to get the sex composition of the catch, which has been hugely valuable and a major improvement in the stock assessment over the last several years. Ian showed us some of the results that are coming in, and it looks like the percent male, percent female, that ratio doesn't change a whole lot from year to year. So it may be something that, cost efficiency wise, may be done on 2 or 3 year intervals if that's more cost effective. So we recommended doing some evaluation to see how that would work out. And then this was kind of the major one that request that we had, which was to examine management procedures based on a 3-year assessment cycle. So where, as I mentioned, doing a full assessment like you'll see today every 3rd year, and in between changing the TCEY as necessary in proportion to changes in the FIS index. And given the amount of data and how much the stock synthesis model changes from year to year, this would be almost not recognizably different from going through the full stock assessment every year. And that could free up a lot of resources, a lot of time to do other kinds of work as well. And there's other precedents for it. Fisheries like for southern bluefin tuna do this over much longer cycles. Next. Yeah, and so that's the end. I'll take any questions if you have them.
Thanks very much, Dr. Cox. Any questions? Neil?
Thanks for the report, Dr. Cox. I was thinking about your recommendation, one of those last ones about shifting to an assessment every 3rd year. And I wondered if the SRB had talked at all about, given what else you know regarding gaps we might want to fill or more work we might want to do, did you have any discussion about what you might do or advise doing with the time saved by virtue of conducting an assessment every 3rd year instead of annually?
I'm sure we did. I don't know if we wrote it down, but I could think of some of the things that I do when I do an assessment every 3rd year and what happens in between. You could look at things like, one being, for example, how often do you need the sex ratio information? You could dig into that kind of research. You could look at the stock synthesis model itself. You could look at some options in there for how to, say, treat age composition data. There's statistical methods that are used in a stock assessment that you could go and look at in more detail. I'm sure Ian's got a few that he could help me out with, but maybe he'll mention some later. But yeah, there's plenty of work to do, in an assessment. Doing this particular assessment for today takes, months of work to get done. I'll probably think of some as soon as I leave.
Any other questions? Yes, Richard.
Along the same lines, did you have any recommendations in those years that you don't have a full stock assessment, metrics that would help decision-making in the interim?
Yeah, that's a good question, because the idea behind doing a management strategy evaluation is to come up with a procedure that meets your objectives. So that doesn't need to be changed. So for example, if the TCEY comes out at some number, 15 million pounds, 20 million pounds, there's really no reason to deviate from that number because it's been tested in simulation to be the best you can do against your objectives. So nevertheless, it is nice to look in between assessments at things, more data-based kind of things. You're not necessarily spending a lot of time doing a lot of modeling. It's okay, where is the FIS? So you'd probably spend quite a bit of time looking at that. You could choose some metrics that you want to track as well. But yeah, we have an example in British Columbia with Pacific herring, where we have done an MSE. We've done all this work. We have a decision rule and a harvest control rule and so on. But the whole MSE simulation is done every year all over again. Every single year it's done. And it's just, people just aren't comfortable, taking what comes out of the rule and just implementing it. So I think with halibut, the stock doesn't fluctuate wildly like herring do. There's some legitimate angst when it comes to things like herring, but for halibut, where the changes are fairly slight from year to year, usually. Yeah.
Any follow-up, Richard? No?
No, thank you very much.
Peter?
Thanks, Dr. Cox. Going back to your earlier meeting and your discussion on coefficients of variation and some ways of investigating potential, how to get more boats and vessels. You had mentioned using snap gear. It was my understanding the studies done prior were somewhat inconclusive. So just curious as to that recommendation of using snap gear when those studies were somewhat inconclusive.
Inconclusive with respect to what?
That inconclusive is they didn't come to a final determining factor that they could apply for a snap vessel versus a fixed line vessel. It's my understanding.
Yeah, I haven't reviewed all those particular studies. We usually go with what the Secretariat has done, and as far as my understanding is that there is not a huge difference between the snap gear and Ian. Just raise your hand if I'm getting this wrong. Oh, good. That there's, so what you try to find out is if they're not that different in their catchability, for example, then you could interchange them under some design protocol. That's my understanding of that.
Okay. Well, thank you very much.
Any other questions for Dr. Cox? Sean, I have one about just you noted in your opening remarks that you're down to 3 out of 4. And are you involved in the process for getting new recruits?
No, I'm not.
Do you have any comments or I'm speaking with Dave. I know there's a process underway, but I think it would be useful for if you had a chance to input on the process.
I'd certainly be willing to. Yeah, I'd be happy to look at it. I think I know what our SRB composition is and kind of where the gaps are. I think it would be helpful.
All right. Thanks very much, Sean. Any other questions for Sean? No? Yeah, sure.
Yes, thank you, Chair. So just regarding that process, the Secretariat team are currently going through a process of looking at what elements are upcoming within the 5-year program of integrated research and monitoring. and for want of a better description, going out and looking at headhunting about 5 or so candidates. And once we have those validated in terms of that their level of interest and their expertise, the intention is to bring it to yourself in particular. And we would greatly value your input, particularly as you've been on the SRB from its inception. And so it would be greatly appreciated if you could review those and then provide some guidance to us in particular about where you see we could get the most value out of one of those candidates in particular. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks very much, Dave. I don't know. I think you've already responded, Sean, so yeah. Any other questions? No, thanks again.
Thank you, and have a good meeting.
Yeah, so we can move on now to fishery monitoring.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. And so we have 2 components to the fishery monitoring agenda item 4. And the first is fishery dependent monitoring data overview for 2022, and that's going to be presented by Dr. Janet. So over to you, Jason. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jason Janet. I'm the Fishery Data Services Branch Manager for IPHC. Great, thank you. And I'll be presenting the Fisheries Data Overview for 2022. And according to him, this should work. If I click this there, hey, look at that. So the first thing I wanted to mention here is where we deployed samplers. Is that a better mouse? Okay, great. Thank you. We deployed samplers in Charleston and Newport and Seattle and Bellingham in 2A. Those folks were all out of the headquarters. And then we actually had folks, port samplers stationed in 2B in Port Hardy and Prince Rupert, and port samplers in 2C stationed in Petersburg, Juneau, and Sitka, in 3A in Seward, Homer, and Kodiak, and 1 port sampler out in 4A in Dutch Harbor. And because St. Paul was closed, there was a number of offloads in Akutan, so we were able to actually deploy the Dutch Harbor sampler to Akutan to do some sampling. It was a good opportunity to work out the logistics of that. However, there was a COVID outbreak when she was there, and she had to be evacuated after sampling only 1 vessel. But at least now we know that that's possible to do in the future. I'll just note that some of these estimates are, all the estimates are net weight. And for the 2022 total mortality, it was 17.7 tons for the year. And the way that breaks down is 70% of that is directed commercial catch. 17% of that was recreational. 9% was non-directed commercial discards, 3% subsistence, and 1% FIS. So if we look at relative to the TCEY, directed commercial landings plus discard mortality was at about 89%, recreational 90%, subsistence 99%, non-directed commercial discard mortality 93% of the TCEY, for a total of 91%. If we look a little deeper into the various regulatory areas, we see that Canada, Area 2B, was 99% of the limit. In the US, in Area 2A, it was 90% of the limit. 2C was 101% of the limit. Regulatory Area 3A, 89% of the limit. 3B, 88% of the limit. 4A, 80% of the limit. 4B, 49%. and 4C, D, E, and the closed area is 91% for our total of 91% for the TCEY. If we include the non-directed commercial discard U26s, that takes the total up to 92%. I'll put these figures up, the cumulative percent attainment, which is on your left, and the cumulative weight landed, which is on your right. This is for all areas. You'll see similar figures broken down by area in the next couple of slides. All of these can be found at our website at the links there provided at the bottom of the slide. The black line is the 3-year average, and the yellow line is the 2022 data. And what you can see for cumulative attainment of the limit in 2022 was below the 3-year average, but cumulative weight landed more or less tracked the 3-year average until towards the end of the season, where it actually started to exceed the 3-year average for all areas. And I should point out, this data is updated through the 10th of January. We will get a few more logbooks in as 2023 continues on from 2022. So there'll be a few updates, but it shouldn't change things much. Okay. Looking at the quota share fishery in Canada, it was open from the 6th of March to the 7th of December. The limit was 2,585 tons. They caught 2,488 tons, or 4% under the limit. And again, if we look at the cumulative percent attainment and the cumulative weight landed for Canada, we see the pattern very similar to what we saw for all areas. Percent attainment a little bit below the 3-year average for most of the season, although towards the end of the season, it's approaching that 3-year average. And for the cumulative weight landed, tracking the 3-year average up until the end of the season, where it starts to actually exceed the 3-year average. Moving on to the direct commercial fishery in Area 2A off the U.S. West Coast. The Treaty Indian directed commercial fishery limit was 226 tons. They landed 226 tons, and so 100% of the fishery limit. The directed commercial fishery limit was 115 tons. They caught 109 tons, so 4% under the limit. For the commercial fisheries that can incidentally retain halibut, the salmon troll fishery limit was set at 20.2 tons. They landed 12 tons, 39% under the limit. For the sablefish fishery, the limit was 23 tons. They landed 28 tons, or 22% over the limit. Cumulative percent attainment in 2A had 2022 was sort of, I think things were getting back to normal after COVID, so that's why you see this cumulative percent attainment for 2022 exceeding the earlier years, because I think in COVID, some of the seasons, particularly the treaty Indian fisheries were delayed. And cumulative weight landed, again, exceeding the 3-year average. For the directed commercial fisheries in Alaska, the quota share fishery limit was 9,757 tons, 8,277 tons were landed, 15% under the limit. In regulatory area 2C, the Annette Island Reserve fishery, there's no limit, but they landed 14 tons. Cumulative percent attainment, again, follows a similar pattern to what we saw for all areas. The 2022 data for percent attainment was below the 3-year average, but the cumulative weight landed tracked the 3-year average up until towards the end of the season, when it started to exceed that 3-year average. terms of recreational data in Canada, allocation was 458 tons. 427 tons were landed, 7% under the limit. In the experimental recreational quota, it was estimated there were 7 tons of removals. That's down here at the bottom. In the US, in Area 2A, off the West Coast, the allocation was 282 tons. 213 tons were landed, 24% under the limit. And that broke down into 18 tons to California, 3% over their limit. Oregon, 82 tons, 37% under the limit. And Washington, 113 tons, 16% under the limit. In Alaska, regulatory area 2C, this is the guided charter sector, was allocated 372 tons, 366 tons were landed, 2% under the fishery limit. The guided angler fish program, where they lease from commercial quota fisheries, landed 45 tons. Recreational in regulatory area 3A, allocation was 957 tons, 798 tons were landed, 17% under the limit. In the guided angler fish program, 3 tons were landed. For the unguided recreational fishery or private anglers in area 2C, there was a 494 tons allocated, 510 tons landed, 3% over the limit. And in regulatory area 3A, private anglers unguided were allocated 717 tons, 536 tons were landed, 25% under the limit. Subsistence fisheries for all the areas are shown in this slide. And I'll just note that the subsistence fisheries in Canada, the estimate is just carried over from the 2007 estimate. And in the US, in Alaska, the subsistence estimate is carried over from the 2020 estimate. The total removals was 440 tons. In Canada, that was 184 tons. In the US, in Area 2A, it was 11 tons. And in Alaska, it was 242 tons. The non-directed commercial discard mortality, the total was 2,306 tons, 152 tons in Canada, 48 tons in Area 2A, and 2,105 tons in Alaska. We just asked the Commission to note paper 07 Rev 1 that provides an overview of key fisheries data regarding Pacific halibut removals during 2022. And with that, I take any questions.
Thank you very much. Any questions? Bob?
Yes, I was looking at slides 6 through 8, and I think it was the weight landed that I was interested in, particularly the last month.
You said slide 6?
Yeah, 6, 7, and 8. Yeah. So
Yeah.
that one, so it says the week of the year on the right-hand side. And the yellow, is that suggesting that there is a significant, on the one to the right,
Oh, sorry.
is that suggesting that there is a rush or people are participating through December 7th to participate in landings where it crosses and goes over the 3-year average?
Oh, right here?
Yeah.
That's one possible explanation for that data for sure, that it could be that folks are kind of holding off and then a number of participants decide to enter it towards the end of the year, perhaps because they've met other quota in other fisheries or something to that effect. For sure, that's certainly a reasonable explanation.
And then if you could go back to slide 6, please. I think that wasn't, this one's for Canada, but let's see.
Oops, sorry, that's 5. There.
So that shows for all areas. Slide 7 must be for the United States, but I'm interpreting that as that there's an interest in delivery as late as our December 7th closure, which surprises me based on some earlier comments we had heard last year. But so could we go to slide 7 also? Well, okay, 6 and 8, I guess, is what I was interested in. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Neil?
Maybe just an observation. It sounds like we may have a bit of a, well, 2 different estimates of the experimental catch for recreational fishery in 2B. So I'd maybe just bookmark that for a follow-up to confirm that we are sharing the right number. And then I had a question about slide 18. You reported these numbers as over and under a fishery limit. I did not understand that the unguided recreational fishery had a limit. Can you maybe just clarify that point?
Oops. Through the chair, sorry. Do you say 18?
Slide 18, yeah. About reg areas 2C and 3A, the unguided rec fishery.
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question? I can't quite hear.
So these numbers are reported as over and under a fishery limit, but I had understood that these fisheries don't actually have a limit. There's an estimate pre-season, but I don't think they have a limit, but perhaps I'm wrong.
That's something I'll have to look into. I was relying on my team for that. Yeah, I don't, I'll have to get back to you on that one. I apologize.
Any other questions? John?
Just to clarify on that, there is no limit. You're right, Neil.
Any other questions or comments? Richard?
On the same question on the same size Bob referred to, the switching over on the right-hand slide of the weight of the fish, and the left is, able to fish up to a limit. So does this have any indication as to the size of fish being caught? We're under our limits in pounds, and then the weight of fish is over. So does that mean we're catching smaller fish in the beginning of the season and bigger fish at the end of the season? What kind of relationship could explain that shift in the graphs that shows we're under the estimated catch, yet we exceed the 3-year average in weight at the end of the season? What's the explanation for that?
Yeah, thank you for the question, through the chair. I think that what happened was that the limits were raised, and so the percent attainment is lower throughout the season, but yet you can still catch the same amount as you would in a 3-year average, if that makes sense, because the limits were raised. Does that answer your question?
What was raised exactly?
Because the limits, I believe the limits were raised. Let's go back to these figures. So for example, here, if you raise the limit, then they're not catching up to the limit, I guess
Right.
is what the point is. And then, but yet they're still catching the same amount, yeah.
So is there any relationship between the composition of the catch that is creating this reversal in the right-hand slide chart?
Yeah, that I don't think we could infer from this figure. This might be a question that would be better answered by someone like Ian.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Thank you very much for the report.
Thank you.
So up next, we have the Fishery Independent Data Overview.
Thank you, Chair. And so while that presentation's just being brought up, I'd like to introduce Ms. Kayla Ualesi, who is the Setline Survey Coordinator. So over to you, Kayla.
Thank you. So I'll be discussing the Fishery Independent Setline Survey design and implementation in 2022. There we go. So I first want to introduce the headquarters team for the survey. There's myself, the Setline Survey Coordinator, Kayla Walesi, and then we have Rachel Rolera and Tyler Jack. And just earlier this month, Kevin Cole joined the headquarters team, as well as the Setline Survey Specialist working in the office supporting the survey. The primary objective of the Fisheries Independent Setline Survey is standardized fishery independent data collection for the Pacific halibut stock assessment and stock distribution estimation. Looking at Pacific halibut distribution and abundance trends through and collecting biological data such as sex, maturity, and age. Both gear and bait are standardized in the Fisheries Independent Setline Survey. For 2022, we used fixed gear with 1,800 feet. That was 1,800 feet with 100 hooks spaced 18 feet apart. Number 3 circle hooks were threaded through the front on 24 to 48 inch or 61 to 122 centimeter ganyons. And 3 to 5 kilogram or 7 to 10 pound weights were placed on each non-anchored skate end. Frozen chum salmon was used as bait throughout the entire FIS survey, with this salmon being number 2 semi-bright or better. And all bait was cut to 1/10 to 1/6 kilogram. And both captains and the Setline Survey Specialist deployed aboard each vessel worked collaboratively to ensure that all bait met standards and captains signed off on bait quality. This represents the plan design for the 2022 FIS. This past year, the 2022 survey ran from May 27th through the 15th of September. And that's in comparison to in 2021, the survey running from the 28th of May to the 14th of September. And in 2020, which was significantly impacted by COVID-19, starting later on June 26th and running till September 9th. This past season, we had 8 vessels participate in the survey, in comparison to 2021, where there was 13 vessels participating and 11 vessels participating in 2020. The 2022 design consisted of 1,188 stations, and this is in comparison to 2021, where we sampled 1,346 stations, and then in 2020, again noting that it was significantly decreased due to COVID, where 951 stations were planned. This represents the ineffective stations and sightings that were observed in 2020. I'm not going to go through every single number on this table, but I do want to specifically highlight our whale depredation in 2C, where we had 6 stations impacted by sperm whale depredation and 7 stations in 3A deemed ineffective due to sperm whale depredation, as well as orca depredation in Area 4A and Area 4 CDE. In total, we had 45 stations deemed ineffective due to various reasons, including depredation, but also shark depredation and gear issues and soak time. This graph it looks at the ineffective station data spanning back to 1998. The blue bars is going to represent whale depredation, noting that when Area 4A in particular and just all of Area 4 are included in the survey design, we do tend to see a larger percentage of whale depredation within the survey. A representation where it's a bit smaller in general is if you look at 2020, we had less ineffective stations that year overall. One may look at that and factor in the fact that we did not sample in Area 4 in 2020. Looking further back, if you look at the considerable difference in the orange bars in the early 2000s, that was due to a significant rise in shark depredation, in particular in areas 3A and 3B over those years. The secondary objective of the FIS is to obtain mid to long-term revenue neutrality, and we strive to achieve that through continuing to improve the fish sale process. We issue a request for tender for each fish sale, and all bids are rated against the same clarified and specified criteria. And we've established these controls for the review and approval of each sale, and then all buyers are invoiced promptly once the sale is complete. We also continue to improve charter agreements, releasing requests for tenders, and specifying the criteria for all submissions. In addition, again, to strive long-term revenue neutrality, we do sell sampled U32 Pacific halibut. I do like to note that the price of the U32 sublegal halibut that we do sample aboard the FIS is retained and sold at a slightly less price. In 2022, the price was approximately 12% less than the lowest legal price. And then our tertiary objective for the Fishery Independent Setline Survey is collaboration. In 2022, we collaborated with the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife to complete 8 rockfish indexations off the coast of Washington. In addition, we also collaborated with them to ensure that all rockfish collected aboard the FIS were sampled dockside. And 100% of those 8 stations were sampled by our setline survey specialists. In addition, we also collaborated with Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. In a similar manner, we collaborated with them to ensure that all rockfish caught in Oregon waters were sampled dockside, and we tagged them while they were being brought on board, and then collaborated with ODFW samplers in order to get that sampling completed. We also collaborate with NOAA Fisheries to collect Pacific cod and spiny dogfish lengths coastwide. And in 2B, we, for the first year, performed a dockside rockfish sampling collaboration with DFO, PHMA, and Archipelago. This was to mimic and somewhat replace deploying a third sampler aboard FIS vessels, and with no longer needing to deploy a third sampler on board the vessels, we were able to work with all 3 organizations and tag the rockfish aboard the vessel, and then collaborate with, in particular, with Archipelago dockside to ensure that rockfish were sampled during the offloads. And then, as always, we continue to be involved in several discussions to continue these collaborations as well as additional. This slide here just provides links to the 2022 and prior year data that is available on the IPHC website. And I welcome all of you guys to check out those links and ask any questions to any of us, as we'll be available throughout the week. And this table shows that the average price coastwide for the FIS 2022 was $7.72. I do want to note that this data is represented in US dollars. We had a 2A at $5.61, and then the highest price was in 2B at $9.01 per pound. Coastwide, again, $7.72 per pound, in comparison to 2021, where we had an average price of $6.87. There we go. And then this slide here shows the average price coastwide dating back through the year 2000, and noting that this past year was our highest average price coastwide at the $7.72. Noting our total sales coastwide, our fish sales totaled $3,194,874.77. And I do have the breakdown here within the table for reference, though I won't go through each number. But there is a difference based looking at 2021, where we did complete additional stations and saw a total sales of $5,498,404. And finally, I wanted to note that 2022 FIS was a bit of a challenging year. As I noted previously, we did have a slightly lower number of vessels participating. In 2022, we had 8 vessels total participate in the survey. There was just a lack of vessel bids. Vessels were not as available as years prior. This was due to a number of reasons, particularly sablefish quota being significantly higher, and vessels that had generally participated previously needing to fish their own sablefish quota. In addition, there were vessels that transitioned from fixed gear to snap gear and were unable to transition their gear back in order to meet the tender specifications of the 2022 FIS. One very important note is that several vessels struggled with crew recruitment and or retention, which we saw pre-season before the FIS, as well as within the season itself. It was a very significant, noteworthy issue, unfortunately. And then also we had a number of vessels that were undergoing various sorts of maintenance that limited their availability for the survey this year. And with that, I welcome any questions. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Kyla. Any questions? Bob?
Kayla, you indicated that the under 26 got about a 12% less. How much weight relative to, do you know what that is?
Thank you. Unfortunately, off the top of my head, I don't have that number, but I can certainly follow up with you. I do have that information available. I believe it's actually noted in our paper. However, I can get the numbers and follow up.
Thank you.
Peter?
Yeah, understanding, you know, how the cost of the FIS is, you know, it's primary concern and discussion point. I see that the bait being a big chunk of, you know, the cost. It seems to me the chunks of bait you're using are pretty large. They're pretty generous, and I'm just wondering what would be needed to say use a smaller piece of bait on average. Would there need to be some analysis done, or just for cost savings?
Thank you. Yes, I do want to note that, so our general, when we calculate our bait needs, we do our fraction is a 0.37, I believe, is our standard. So that's like a little bit over a third is what we use to confirm our bait needs. However, as you mentioned, there's most vessels do tend to err on the lower end of that range within our tender specifications. In order to change the tender specifications, we would have to, do some analysis of that. But it's definitely something potentially worth looking into.
Thank you, Kayla.
Richard?
Yes, if you could reference slide 7. So this is the ineffective station. So I see, the whale depredation is about average, but I see if I'm correct, the logistics, gear, and weather and bait seem to be a larger proportion this past year. But overall is like up to 5%. So I'm just trying to get on how effective was the overall FIS? Where was this problems with the logistics in terms of all the areas? Did this happen mostly out west or southeast, or where's most of that problems, the ineffective stations due to logistics and bait? And
Thank you. So while you reference slide 7, I wanted to actually step back one additional slide where this will actually show you, it breaks down that information for this given year. There were 45 stations that were deemed ineffective. There were stations, as noted in the paper, that were left unsampled this past year. However, that was not included in the ineffective station total. These are just purely stations that were attempted and deemed ineffective for a number of reasons. The logistical reasons, those ones in this red bar here, would have fallen under a number of different issues within this table. So it would have been all stations under gear issues, as well as soak time and the station being moved. So not necessarily one area really more significantly impacted. If you notice all of them are just 1 or 2 stations within a given regulatory area. It's just a matter of, unfortunately, there being, for example, 7 total coastwide this year had gear issues, which were due to a number of reasons. But I wouldn't necessarily say it was an issue based on a certain area. Whereas, like I've previously mentioned, whale depredation, we tend to point to area 4, but the logistical challenges just seem to be kind of haphazardly throughout coastwide.
So follow up. So the ineffective stations, how is that tied into the overall data? Say, like this year, if we found the set line survey to be down in a lot of areas, and is this 5% significant or pretty much something that's calculated in the effectiveness of the overall set line? So how, I'm just trying to see if there's a relationship between this slide and the productivity of the set line survey in certain regions.
Thank you. And Dr. Ian Stewart can definitely answer this question probably more eloquently than I could. However, that's why I do want to include this slide to note that, yes, in 2021 and in this past year, 2022, we did have, closer to that 5% mark of total ineffective stations. However, those ineffective stations are not included in all analysis of the data. That's why they're flagged and separated out. And again, I apologize. Dr. Webster and Dr. Stewart can definitely respond better as far as when or if this data is used, but I do know that they are flagged in order to not be used in all portions of the assessment.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard. Any other questions? Peter?
Yeah, just on that, I believe, has the criteria for designating whaled, either killer whale or sperm whale, it's also changed over time along with this graph, right?
Yes, thank you. And yes, that is correct. Every year we do attend a marine protected species marine mammal training through the Alaska Fisheries Science Center, and our standards for the entire survey meet or exceed the same standards that NOAA is using aboard all of their research surveys. However, as you noted, yes, over time, comparing this data from early 2000s, our criteria has definitely improved, but changed over time. So there's a factor that has to be included when you're comparing this data.
Okay, thank you very much.
Any other questions? Nope. Thank you very much, Kyla.
Thank you.
All right, we can move on to agenda item 5. Stock status of Pacific halibut and harvest decision table.
Great, thank you, Chair. And so we have Dr. Webster who's going to present these two papers to you, paper 09 and then paper 10. So over to you, Ray.
represent uncertainty in terms of 95% intervals about the true value, about the estimated value. And so those intervals are supposed to be interpreted as that there's a 95% chance that the true value is somewhere inside those intervals. And we can see that in Region 3, there was a substantial decrease in 2022 compared to 2021, which is what those percentages in the lower left-hand corners represent. And that drove the overall coastwide decrease in the index of minus 18% between 2021 and 2022. Indices have changed over time for those group of stations. And this will be part of a group of online tools that we'll be demonstrating tomorrow in this room, I believe, from 5 p.m. onwards. So we welcome people to come along and we can work you through some of the online tools you have available to explore the FIS data and other elements of the IPHC work. Okay, and I believe that's the end of that short presentation. Happy to take any questions. Just recommendation is the Commission note the accompanying paper. But the next presentation is also my own, and I can continue onto that if there are no questions.
Thanks very much, Dr. Webster. Any questions? Peter.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Webster. My question's about the time. I can't remember the factors, but it uses the previous 3 years in each station for the model, I believe. And I can't remember how that's weighted, but how does that affect, when a FIS is falling sharply? Does it smooth that out over time? Just that's a question.
Thank you, Commissioner DeGreef. It used to be a number of years ago that we did exactly what you described and used a 3-year weighting of the index, but now essentially the model is doing the weighting, and it's using all the data to come up with an estimate in the current year. But the further you go back in time, the less influence that information has on the current year's estimate. And so that's represented by what we call the temporal autocorrelation parameter, which in most of the models is around 0.95 or 95%, or between 0.9 and 0.95, which means that the correlation between this year's and last year's value at a particular station is in the order of 90 to 95%, and that fades quickly over time. So to summarize, we're using all the information to estimate the current year's data, but there's no explicit weighting. It's worked out within the model. That does have a smoothing effect on the terminal year, and it's something we see in the past I've shown some figures which demonstrated that by showing what last year's value was estimated at last year compared to its revised estimate this year. And so if the index drops from 2021 to 2022, it generally drops the estimated, if the estimated index will drop a little less than it would have if we weren't using the space-time modeling. So it is smoothing the data out to some degree.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions for Dr. Webster? We can go on to the next presentation, right?
Okay, on to my next presentation, which is a longer presentation. I'm going to see if I can get this wobbly mouse to work. Okay, so this is on the 2023 to 25 FIS design evaluation, and that includes at the end of the presentation the proposed designs and commission and endorsed designs for 2023 to 25. So I'll begin by presenting some background on the FIS history, design objectives, and review process. I present a version of this every year because I know every year there's somebody new in the audience who may not have seen the presentation before, the information before. The proposed FIS designs for 2023 to 25, which we proposed earlier in the year, scientific evaluation and revision of those designs, and briefly talk about the consideration of cost and the commission endorsed design for 2023. Got it. Okay. The IPHC FIS, you've already heard quite a bit about our fishery independent setline survey today. It's our most important source of data on Pacific halibut. It provides data for estimating weight and numbers per unit effort, indices of density and abundance of Pacific halibut. And this is used to estimate stock trends, used to estimate stock distribution, using the output of the space-time modeling that I presented in the previous presentation, and an important input in the IPHC stock assessment, and also provides biological data, ages, lengths, genetic information, and so on, for use in the stock assessment. So a standardized FIS has been conducted by the IPHC each year since 1993. There were FISs prior to that in the 60s, 70s, 80s, but the standardization in its current form began in 1993, standardized for bait and fishing gear. So these are the data that we're using in our modeling. From 1993 to 97, the coverage was limited and generally restricted to the core areas of the stock, 2B, 2C, 3A, and 3B. And the modern FIS design on a 10 by 10 nautical mile grid began in 1998. And by 2001, we had annual coverage occurring in all IPHC regulatory areas within a depth range of 20 to 275 fathoms in the Gulf of Alaska and Aleutian Islands, and in 75 to 275 fathoms along the Bering Sea shelf edge. The Bering Sea has a lot of shallow water, and it was just prohibitively expensive for us to consider a design like the one we were implementing elsewhere in the Bering Sea. By 2010, data from other sources showed that not all Pacific halibut habitat was covered by the FIS. We found information showing that Pacific halibut were present outside the FIS depth range in both deep and shallow waters, and that each IPHC regulatory area had coverage gaps even within the standard depth ranges. And such unsampled habitat meant that there was a potential for bias in the estimates derived from FIS data. The estimates that we were getting might be too high or too low, depending on the densities in the habitat that we weren't sampling. And therefore, we undertook a series of FIS expansions from 2011 to 2019, covering previously unsampled habitat. At the end of those expansions, we were left with a 1,890 station 10 by 10 nautical mile grid representing all IPHC regulatory areas between the depths of 10 and 400 fathoms. And those stations are shown in orange on this map. We also, as noted earlier, we use data from trawl surveys in the Gulf and the Bering Sea to augment our own data when we don't have surveys in the Bering Sea, which we've only done on the flats in 2 years, in 2006 and 2015, providing us with that calibration between the two gear types. But we use the data from those trawl surveys in our modeling and analysis as well. So the FIS itself has 3 objectives and corresponding design layers. We have our primary objective, which is to sample Pacific halibut for stock assessment and stock distribution estimation. This is our scientific objective, if you like. And we have minimum sampling requirements in terms of station distribution, station count, and skates per station. And this is the guiding objective that I look to when designing surveys for coming years. What do we need in order to get the scientific information that we need for the stock assessment, stock distribution? But that's not the only objective. We have secondary objective, which my colleague Kayla has talked about earlier, which is long-term revenue neutrality. And that brings in logistics and cost, the operational feasibility and the revenue of the FIS. Then we have tertiary objectives, minimizing the impact on the stock, assisting others to collect data, such as other agencies, and IPHC policies, which may result in ad hoc decisions of the Commission regarding the FIS design. This timeline shows the review process in terms of the scientific component of that process. I consider the process for designing each survey as beginning in March, following the annual meeting, when we have all the data from the previous year available, and we can work with that data. We have the decisions made by the Commission at that point on what the survey will look like in the current year. And so that process begins over the March to May period, where we work on analytical approaches to produce something that can be reviewed by the Scientific Review Board at their June meeting. They may recommend further work subsequent to their meeting. We will present what we have to the commissioners for a first look at the work meeting in September, and then the Scientific Review Board will have a second look. After that, the FIS data are finalized for the current year. So we don't have access to the data in the current year because the FIS is underway until the middle of September. And then there's quality control and checking until the end of September. Then after the data become available, that's when I do the modeling of the FIS data. The commissioners make a decision on the designs going forwards at the interim meeting. And then there may be adjustments to that designs that were endorsed by the commissioners at the meeting, at the current meeting, the annual meeting. Throughout this process, we seek and welcome input from stakeholders and other interested parties. This can be at the preparation stage through discussions with charter vessel operators, during the FIS itself, where we certainly get feedback from those running the FIS, and by talking with folks out there in the ports and so on. We get feedback post-FIS. We have the Research Advisory Board, which provides important input on our scientific endeavors in late November, just prior to the interim meeting, and during the charter bid submission period. But we welcome input from stakeholders and other interested parties and other involved parties throughout the year regarding the design of the FIS. So the proposed FIS designs for 23 to 25. These designs use an efficient sub-area sampling in IPHC regulatory areas 2A, 4A, and 4B, which we've done in previous years, and incorporated randomized design in the core areas of the stock 2B, 2C, 3A, and 3B. We continued to propose sampling all standard FIS stations in IPHC regulatory area 4CDE for scientific reasons. It's a highly dynamic area with apparently northward shifting distribution and uncertainty regarding connectivity with populations near to and within Russian waters. We note that complete sampling did not take place in 2021. We sampled the north of the Bering Sea shelf edge only, and also in 2022 when we sampled only the southern portion, although that does mean we sampled the complete FIS design over the 2-year period 21 to 2022. We also note the following recommendation from the Scientific Review Board. They noted our presentation of different alternative designs. They recommended that we prioritize sampling designs that include IPHC regulatory area 4 CDE, despite the relatively low contribution of this area to overall biomass and variance. This region is an important area to monitor for future range shifts, and biological samples collected here are likely to be important for understanding the biology of the Pacific halibut at the leading range edge. So this was our proposed science-based design that we presented to the Scientific Review Board for 2023, the current year, which we presented to them at the June meeting of last year. So this design has a randomized design in the core areas, as I just noted. So you'll see at random, it's a more than 50% sampling rate. It features quite an extensive design in regulatory area 2A, and I'll talk about that briefly in a moment, from Northern California up to the Canadian border. We have 2 sub-areas sampled in each of 4A and 4B. I'll note that the Western Aleutians in 4B was an area that we had targeted for sampling in 2022, and that we were unable to get a charter vessel to have a successful bid on. So we brought it forward again to 2023. It's an area we haven't sampled for some time. And likewise, the shelf edge in 4A is an area that hasn't been sampled for some time. 2024, again, the randomized design in the core areas, but then going back to a smaller footprint at the ends of the stock. And the only difference between 24 and 25 is that we're adding the southeastern part of 4A, which is a very low density part of 4A, but it won't have been sampled previously since 2019. So for 2023 to 24, we had presented designs for those 2 years because we're presenting the next 3 years of designs each year. We had presented designs for those years in 2021. But we made some changes from those designs based on the data that we received in 2021, I'm sorry. So in particular, IPHC regulatory area 2A, we added the moderate density waters of Southern Washington, Northern Oregon, and Northern California, which we previously had not proposed before 2025. And we had information that densities were possibly increasing in California. And we also had some concerns about the coefficient of variation, the variance, the uncertainty in the estimates we were getting from 2A. It seemed that at the time we did the analysis that the variability was increasing and we were getting greater uncertainty in those estimates, and subsequently in the estimates of the contribution of 2A to the overall stock distribution. So that was our motivation for increasing the survey footprint in 2A. In 4B, as I mentioned, we have the western area because we failed to get a suitable charter bid in 2022. The Scientific Review Board at their 020 meeting last year endorsed the final 2023 FIS design and provisionally endorsed the 24 to 25 designs presented above. At their subsequent meeting, they reiterated their endorsements while recognizing that the 2023 design will need to be further optimized to ensure other commission objectives are met, including but not limited to maintaining long-term revenue neutrality. So I talked a little bit about uncertainty, and it's one of the key factors that we assess when proposing designs in subsequent years. And we measure this in terms of the coefficient of variation, or CV, which is a measure of relative uncertainty. It's the standard deviation of an estimate divided by the mean. So in this case, the standard deviation of the survey index, the FIS index, overall index, divided by the mean. And so we have a target range for each IPHC regulatory area based on maintaining the historical quality of the estimates that we obtain of within 15% or less each for each area. And so for the core areas, for the designs that we proposed, and for CDE, where we not only have our own proposed stations, but also an extensive data source from the NIMS Troll Survey, those CVs would be well within those target range. It's not a concern for those IPHC regulatory areas. They also have randomized and full sampling designs, which will result in unbiased estimation. That means the thing we're estimating is being estimated by the data that we're collecting. In other regulatory areas, we project the following CVs after completion of the 2025 FIS, bearing in mind that 15% or less target. Those designs that we proposed to the Scientific Review Board are projected to maintain coefficients of variation within the target range, at or within the 15% level over the 3-year period from 2023 to 2025. Now, it's worth noting, though, that as alluded to earlier, the estimates for the current year not only bring in the data that we received in that year, but also is influenced by the information we had in previous years. And that also goes for intermediate years. If we have an estimate, we've revised it for 2023, that's also updated based on the data that we got in 2024 and 2025 and other subsequent years. So it's important not just to look at what 2023 looked like after we completed 2025 survey, but what it looks like in the terminal year when it's the year that we're fishing, which is this year, because that's the information that will feed into management decisions directly. And so we note that the CVs, based on the surveys that we proposed for 2023, will also be within our target range. The other key factor we look at is bias, and that's that we need the survey to be designed in such a way that it's actually estimating the thing we're interested in, which in this case is the index of density, the stock trends, and the stock distribution. To minimize bias, so there's the potential for bias if we're not doing a comprehensive survey. If we have a randomized design, like in the core areas, we're safe. If we have a design such as at the ends of the stock where we might be leaving out components of that, it could be that we're missing some kind of signal. We're missing a trend in those areas that we're not sampling, which may differ from the areas that we are sampling. So we want to minimize our risk of not seeing that trend. So sampling sufficiently frequently that we pick up any important signal, any important change in the density in those areas that we may not be sampling every year. And at present, we're basing these estimates of the likelihood of missing a sizable change, and by sizable, I'm looking at a 10% change in relative proportion of the overall biomass contributed to by the areas that we're not sampling over the period that we're not sampling them. So this is based on the data that we've observed previously. How likely are those kind of changes? How likely are those kind of changes, that 10% or more, to occur over a period in which we might be considering not sampling those areas? So, for example, if a sub-area, some component of 2A or 4A or 4B, it may have a biomass that changes by no more than 8% over 1 or 2 years, but up to 12% over 3 years. So 8%, it's not a great deal in the big picture, but 12% is starting to get towards the kind of signal that we really want to be able to see. And so if that's what's happening in the sub-area, then we should sample that area, those stations, at least every 3 years in order to detect a change as large as that. And so based on those criteria, the maximum expected unobserved change from the designs that we were proposing over the period is within 10%, except for 2022, which has already happened. And the 2022 value in 4B at 13% is due to the fact that we were unable to sample the Western Aleutians in 2022. But for the designs that we proposed, that will bring the chance of a large bias over the unsampled period back to levels that are acceptable. And this is a little bit complicated to explain. I should note that we have made a proposal for a change to the way this is assessed, and that will be presented at the SRB next year. Thanks. There we go. Okay, so this is the scientific basis for proposing the designs, but I've also mentioned the other objectives, and the secondary objective is long-term revenue neutrality. So we already incorporate some consideration of cost in those designs. If I was to design my dream FIS design, it would be completely randomized stations each year in all areas, but that is logistically inefficient, particularly in areas of the stock where densities are very low or where the halibut tend to be concentrated in relatively small parts of the stock. And so the goal here is to provide statistically efficient and logistically feasible designs for consideration by the Commission. Now, we note that the FIS is funded by sales of captured fish and is intended to have long-term revenue neutrality, meaning that any design must be also evaluated in terms of the following factors: expected catch of Pacific halibut, expected Pacific halibut sale price, charter vessel costs, including relative costs per skate and per station, bait costs, and IPHC Secretariat's costs. Now, in recent years, balancing these factors has resulted in modifications to the science-based design proposals that we present to the SRB. In general, we have had a need to increase sampling effort in high-density regions and decrease effort in low-density regions. That is, increase effort where the FIS is generating revenue and decrease effort where the FIS is running at a loss. Now, at IM098, the Secretariat presented a sequence of designs with varying costs to the commissioners, ranging from the science-based proposal that you've seen already to a revenue-neutral option. And I'm not going to present all of those designs options. They've already been considered by the Commission, but you can find those discussed in the interim meeting and documents and presentations. So I'll move to the Commission-endorsed design from the interim meeting. The Commission endorsed a 2023 FIS design that provides some coverage in all IPHC regulatory areas except for CDE, where I will note, if I don't notice in subsequent slides, that we are expecting to get data from the NIMS Trawl Survey and likely the Alaska Department of Fish and Game Northern Sound Trawl Survey as well. So that means we'll have information from all IPHC regulatory areas with the Commission-endorsed design. The endorsed design has comprehensive spatial coverage in IPHC regulatory areas 2B, 2C, and 3B, extensive coverage in 3A with 3 revenue-negative charter regions emitted, and minimum coverage in IPHC regulatory areas 2A, 4A, 4B with 16 stations per area in the highest density habitat. And I will note this paragraph from the report, from the interim meeting report. The Commission endorsed an optimized design for the 2023 FIS as provided at Appendix 4 that balances the Commission's primary and secondary objectives for the FIS. As with all years, the Commission will have an additional opportunity to modify the 2023 FIS design at AM099, the current meeting. And this is the Commission-endorsed design. As you can see, again, the orange stations are those that are endorsed for sampling in 2023 by the FIS. And you can see we have complete coverage in 2B and 2C, except for the inside waters of 2B. We have extensive coverage in 3A with the emission of 3 revenue-negative charter regions, which are in purple in the map. We have comprehensive coverage in 3B, almost complete coverage, except for a random selection of stations in the west of 3B, where revenues are lower. And then we have minimum coverage, in 2A, 4A, and 4B. Those areas were selected for some coverage because those in recent years have been the highest density parts of those areas at the ends of the stock. And we are depending on the data from the trawl surveys as mentioned for 4CDE. So we're also expected to use a maximum of 8 skates per station. No sampling in 3 region 3B as mentioned. This will provide us with good coast-wide estimates. Noting that we have data from past years, providing some information on 2023 as well, and overall low risk of bias. Imprecise estimates and potential for bias at the ends of the stock. So overall, on a coastwide basis, this is still a good survey. But if we break it down to the final level, there will be imprecision, high CVs at estimates, and potential for bias in areas 2A, 4A, and 4B in particular, and less precise stock distribution estimates than the science-based proposals that you saw previously. So there are compromises in this design based on the different objectives that we need to consider when considering designs. But the commission endorsed design will still sample the bulk of the IPHC of the Pacific halibut stock. We know that approximately 70 to 80% of the Pacific halibut stock by weight is in the 4 core areas, 2B, 2C, 3A, and 3B. High sample size of 958 stations provides precise coastwide time series estimates and relatively low bias at the coastwide level. As mentioned, precision targets are unlikely to be met in IPHC regulatory areas 2A, 4A, and 4B in 2023. And there's increased risk of bias in the estimates for those areas and estimates of stock distribution. The design is likely to result in indices and biological data that maintain basic stock assessment inputs, but with higher uncertainty in 2023. Now, given that design, assuming no sampling at the or very little sampling at the ends of the stock in 2023, then the design proposals in 2024 and subsequent years are almost certainly going to include fishing sub-areas that we had originally proposed in our science-based designs in 2023 for 2024 in IPHC regulatory areas 2A, 4A, and 4B. And there's also potential for addition of more stations to 2024 and 25 designs that you saw previously to bring estimates closer to achieving precision and bias targets. So those are the things that are likely to happen in the proposed science designs that we present to the Scientific Review Board in 2023. The recommendations are for the commissioners to note the accompanying paper and to recommend any ad hoc modifications to the design for 2023 if necessary, and associated funding as if needed. And with that, I'm happy to take questions.
Thanks very much, Dr. Webster. Any questions? John?
Thank you, Paul. Dr. Webster, a few questions. I'm going to start with Area 2A, and this has to do with bias, but I guess a different type of bias than what you addressed in slide 18, where we may not have survey stations in a given area. I've heard from certain stakeholders in Area 2A, and I imagine you have too, concerns about the degree to which the setline survey is effective in uneven bottom and perhaps may result in underestimating halibut distribution abundance. Could you comment on that, please?
Yes, thank you for the question. This is something, yes, we're certainly aware of those concerns. It is something we addressed in the North Coast of Washington. I think it was 2017 to 2018, where we essentially doubled station density off the North Coast of Washington to address those concerns. In particular, that there was a element of habitat at a certain depth range that the FIS was not sampling well, or was perhaps undersampling, but that was a component that had higher densities than what we were sampling. So it's something we've addressed in the past. I would note that the design of the FIS is spatially comprehensive. A design with, I think, the overall FIS in 2A, regardless of the gaps, as you noted, due to other considerations, is a 206 station design. And on its own, that provides very precise estimates. If there's habitat we're missing, it's likely to be a very small component of the habitat. And this is, via the analysis and kind of the proof of concept that we did in 2017 to 2018 with the denser grid, if that's a relatively small element of the habitat, even if it has a very high density, when you average it across the entire range of the stock from Northern California to the California, to the Canadian border, it's likely to have a very small influence on the overall average for the stock. So, we looked at values many times the average in habitat that we might be missing and try to work out how that would play through. But in general, the areas that are highlighted are often very small in terms of bottom area. It's something we're certainly open to further discussions with, and I know it's something that we have ongoing discussion with commissioners regarding. So it's in the past, that was one of the ad hoc decisions of the commissioners to increase the density of stations in Area 2A for those years. But we certainly welcome further discussions on where the survey may be improved if there's a belief that we're missing something.
Okay, thank you. That's very helpful. Second question is maybe a bit of a bigger picture issue. I wonder if you could characterize the Secretariat's readiness to make changes to ensure adequate bids and coverage in the survey. And I guess what I'm thinking of is things like a shift to snap gear or other modifications that may be necessary to attract bids out west where it's been difficult to get coverage, as I understand it.
Thank you. And yes, that's an excellent question. And it's certainly something that we've been considering, in particular with regards to the SNAP, the possibility of using SNAP gear vessels on the FIS. We've had 3 experiments comparing SNAP gear with fixed gear over recent years in 2C, 2B, and 3A. And that's given us some information on the differences we can expect between the 2 gear types in terms of the index. It's not as much information as we liked, but we are now considering the use of SNAP vessels on the FIS in order to maximize the number of vessels that are available. And if we have SNAP vessels running on the FIS in 2023 or subsequent years, that will provide additional information on the difference between the 2 gear types. But I think Dr. Wilson can correct me if I'm mischaracterizing this in any way, but I think our view is now it's better to have data, even if there's some element of uncertainty because of the difference in the gear types, than having no data at all in some of those areas.
Okay, thanks. And one final question. On your slide 11, you referred to an SRB recommendation to try to be sensitive to northward shifts in distribution, the extreme edge of the range, presumably in response to climate change. So I wonder if you could characterize the extent to which the FIS is, and maybe in conjunction with the NOAA trawl survey, is set up to recognize those kinds of shifts.
Thank you. Yes, this is something that I've analyzed in a paper on the FIS that was published, I think, in 2020. The FIS, in combination with the NIMS trawl survey, when it has its greatest spatial extent up into the Bering Strait, is very well set up to analyze those shifts. We have our own 10 nautical mile. If we implement the design as proposed as a full design as proposed, we have very fine scale monitoring at a 10 nautical mile grid, a relatively low density area all the way up until the Russian border. And the NIMS trawl survey itself is sampling at generally a 20 nautical mile square grid up into the Bering Strait in generally much lower densities. So with that extensive spatial coverage, that gives us a very good ability to detect range shifts in Pacific halibut. And I was able to estimate relatively precisely for example, the center of biomass of the distribution of the Pacific halibut in the Bering Sea. And you can track how that changes over time, a figure I can happily provide the commissioners with. And over the last 10 or so years, up until the last couple of years where I haven't updated that figure, but we saw a marked shift, northward drift in the distribution of Pacific halibut. And that's largely driven by the detection of greater numbers of fish on the NIMS and Alaska Department of Fish and Game trawl survey in the northern part of the Bering Sea. But having that information from our own survey right up into the Russian waters is also important. Of course, we lack data from Russia itself, but at least on the US side of the border, those 2 surveys, or 3 surveys combined, provide very good information on tracking shifts in the distribution.
Thank you very much.
Other questions for Dr. Webster? Peter?
Yeah, just in terms of the bait that I was talking to, yeah, what kind of analysis could be done? Would it be cost effective to do so? And I just see it as a possible savings.
Thank you. So we've tackled a similar problem before due to the cost of chum salmon as a bait. And in 2012, we had an extensive coast-wide comparison of three different types of bait to other species of bait compared with chum salmon. And it was, every station was fished with, I believe, 8 skates where we had 4 skates of chum salmon and then a gap with an unbaited string to so that the different baits weren't influencing each other with their different scent plumes. So, and then at the ends of each skate, each set were the 2 other bait types, which I believe were pink salmon and pollock, I think. And I think we looked at herring in a pilot study as well. Someone can correct me if I've misremembered that. It's been 11 years now. But what we found was that there were differences between the baits, and that those differences in the catch rates of halibut and in the catch rates of non-target species, and those differences varied across the coast. So switching from one bait to another would be to a new bait would be a complicated process that might bring in changes in our understanding of the trends that were complex and possibly hard to understand. We would have to do a similar process if we were changing the size of the bait. I mean, we wouldn't have. No, it would be very similar. It's possible that with a smaller bait, if this is what the suggestion is, or any change in the bait, that it might have a different ability to attract halibut to the bait. It might attract different types of sizes of bycatch species, different sizes of halibut might be able to get caught on the bait, and those differences might vary across the coast from 2A to 4CD. Like we saw great differences in the way the different baits operated and varied from each other in 2012. So it would require that kind of study, and which would not be an expensive undertaking in order to fully understand any kind of change in the bait going forwards.
Okay, thank you. One other question, just in terms of, actually, no, that's fine. I think you answered it with the last, yeah, I'm thinking about it.
Any other questions for Dr. Webster? Neil?
Dr. Webster, I may be suffering from short memory, but have we ever sort of broken out the main components of the survey cost? Like, I'm thinking of Peter's question about bait and the potential for cost savings. Does the Secretariat have an understanding of, fuel is this amount, bait is this amount, and so on?
I believe so, but my colleagues can speak to that in greater detail.
Yes, through the chair, very much so. We do break that down both as an estimate and then also in terms of expenses incurred each year. And so we could certainly draw that out as percentages overall. If that's what you're looking at, or something similar, would be appreciated. Thank you.
So you want to see that? Yeah. Yeah, so just to clarify, Dave, yes, that would be helpful. Any other questions for Dr. Webster? No, thank you. So we're scheduled for a break, and if we got back together at 3:30.
are at the lowest level of performance or efficiency that we've seen over the last 3 decades. Both the Fishery Independent Setline Survey and the fishery have shown over the last 2 years have shown a very marked transition from older fish, primarily the 2005 year class and older, to younger fish, comprised primarily right now of the 2012 year class. In between, we've had a fairly large gap in recruitment from 2006 to 2011. And that low recruitment during that time period is going to continue to reduce our overall stock productivity in the short term. We are now finally, thankfully, at least across that gap in recruitment in terms of both the fishery and the survey, but we're going to continue to see the effects of those years of low recruitment for several more years to come. So to give us a bit of context, you can see here that the stock, that Pacific halibut stock, fluctuates quite broadly. This is the mortality from all sources back to the 1960s. We had a period of fairly high mortality in the 1960s and 70s, then a low in the late 1970s, one peak in the 1980s, following some very good recruitments, and then the stock peaked, hit the 100-year peak in the early 2000s. And from then we had a fairly strong decline into around 2010 to 12. And since then, the mortality limits have been relatively consistent at around 40 million pounds with some ups and downs. And to give you a little bit more detailed look at some of the more recent information, so the top figure here, the top table shows you what we projected last year based on the mortality limits that were adopted at the 98th annual meeting. So at the time that the mortality limits were put in place, we were projecting just about 42.5 million pounds, noting that we project the 3-year average for non-directed discards or bycatch as a way to smooth out some of the year-to-year variation, and because we don't really know exactly what it's going to be in an upcoming year. We do see years when it goes up or down. On the bottom here, you see what was estimated for this year's stock assessment analysis. And I'll note here that you heard a presentation earlier from Dr. Janet, which provided very detailed information on updated sources of mortality for all of these different components. These numbers that you see here will vary slightly from those you heard earlier, just because these were the numbers that we finalized at the time of the stock assessment, which was November 1 this year. However, note that when we move into projections for 2022, we will have a few updates, and those will be included in the projected values. So that's why you might see a few differences here. But note that when at the time of the stock assessment, we estimated that we were just a little bit below 40 million pounds. So in aggregate, the mortality that we actually saw in 2022 turned out to be a bit less than we had projected. I will note, though, that the commercial discards increased fairly substantially beyond what we projected. The projection for 2022 used the rate of discard that we estimated for the fishery in 2021. And this increase in discards in the commercial fishery is largely due to the shift to younger fish. So the 2012 year class, many of those fish, both males and females, are still below the 32-inch minimum size limit. And as the fishery shifted quite strongly in 2022 to that year class, we saw an increase in discards. So we're now at about 1.5 million pounds coastwide of commercial discards. And most of those are related to the minimum size limit, with just a smaller component associated with lost gear and with legal fish that are discarded at the end of a trip as quotas are attained. I will note that for projection purposes, we've updated the estimate for non-directed discards from 2022, and it comes in a little bit higher than the initial estimate that we had in November. However, the 3-year average is still actually quite close to the estimate for 2022, and is quite close to the initial value that we had, and is somewhat less than the value for 2022, given that 2023, given that 2022 and 2021 were slightly lower. And I'll speak to that a little bit more in a second. But just noting that we're using the 3-year average moving forward. So the change in 3-year average was actually fairly small. To put this in a little bit of context with recent years, so the blue line across the top is the mortality limit that was adopted at the time, noting that the commission didn't start adopting TCEYs until 2018. So the dashed line is the TCEY that was associated with the limits that were set at the time. And the gray bars just show you the estimate of the mortality that actually occurred accruing to those levels. And you can see that up until about 2019, the fishery has been historically very close to the limits. We generally catch almost exactly what the aggregate limits are. Certain sectors may be a little bit ahead or behind, but in the end, it all generally washes out, and we end up quite close to the limits, which is a good thing in terms of management. We note that in 2020, we saw many sectors come in below what had been projected and below the limits for those sectors due to all the challenges that occurred in 2020. And what we've seen in 2021 and 2022 is as the mortality limits have come up just slightly in those 2 years, we've seen the overall mortality itself come up, but it has lagged behind slightly. So we've still, for the last couple of years, we've come in slightly below the aggregate limit. Now, I will note that when we do the stock assessment, we use the actual mortality and not the limit that was set, because we're trying to come up with the best estimate of the population dynamics we can, and that's the mortality that actually occurred. So if you look at this and think, well, what happens to those fish that we saved in those years? Well, those savings, those extra fish that weren't caught that we thought were going to be caught, are included in the assessment results each year. So this year, the assessment results reflect the fact that we actually gave the stock a little bit more of a break in the last 3 years than we thought we were going to. This just graphically shows you the trend over the last several decades in commercial discard mortality. And I'm just highlighting this because that is the one place where we saw a fairly large increase from 2021 to 2022. You can see that we had much more commercial discard back in the period around 2010. We saw a decrease as mortality limits were brought down after 2010, and we had some years of lower recruitment. We saw a decrease in commercial discard mortality, and then just in the last couple of years, we've seen that tick back up again. In terms of non-directed commercial discards or bycatch, we have seen over a period of several decades, we've seen a large reduction and a fairly steady decline in our estimates of Pacific halibut that die as a function of fisheries that can't retain those fish. We do see in 2022, we have a slight increase in that estimate, which brings it back up to a level just above where we were in 2021 and 2020, but still substantially less than where we were even as recently as 2019. And again, this reflects changes in many of these fisheries, as well as some changes over time in encounter rates with Pacific halibut, particularly in the last few years, perhaps as recruitment has been somewhat lower during that period from 2006 to 2011. There may have been some decreased encounter rates in some fisheries in some places. So moving now into some of the fishery independent data. You saw from Dr. Webster just a few minutes ago the presentation of results, the modeled fishery independent setline survey trends. And here I've taken 3 different slides from his presentation and boiled them down to just the coastwide trends. From left to right, this is the numbers per skate, the total pounds per skate in the center, and the legal or O32 pounds per skate on the right. And you can see that the trends become a little bit steeper as you move from left to right. And particularly that percent change from 2021 to 2022 grows a bit more pronounced as you move toward legal fish. And what this is telling us, we saw a similar pattern last year. And what this is telling us is that the biggest changes in the last few years in the stock have been in the larger fish. They've been in the legal size biomass. And the numbers have had a much smaller effect. And that's because we've essentially in the last few years been replacing larger, older fish with younger, smaller fish. Now on the fishery independent setline survey, of course, we sample every fish that we handle. We can tell males from females on the spot. And this particular figure shows you the age distribution from our fishery independent survey going back all the way into the early 1990s. Each column of circles here is a year, and the y-axis is the age of those fish. So the size of the circle represents the proportion of the survey catch at that age in that year. So bigger circle means there were a lot of fish at that age, smaller circle means not as many. If I highlight some of the stronger year classes here, in this case, this is the 1987 year class, which we believe to be the strongest year class in the last 100 years. This single year class produced over 220 million pounds of yield over its lifetime. So this was a huge year class, and it buoyed the productivity of the stock up for decades. Moving to the right, I've also highlighted here the 2005 year class. We had some other year classes, 99 and some others in between there. 2005 has been the most recent year class that was of fairly large magnitude, and it has been very important to the fishery and the survey in the last several years. Finally, on the right, I've highlighted the 2012 year class, and you'll note that for the last 2 years, the largest circle in the vertical, in the stack of circles here has been the 2012 year class. So the survey, for the first time in 2021, caught the most numerous age in the survey in 2021 was the 2012 year class, 9 years old at the time. The most numerous year class in the 2022 survey was 10 years old, and again, same year class, 2012. So we saw this transition 2 years ago in the survey. You can see in between those last two greenish lines that I've put up there, you see there's a whole lot of small circles. And that's effectively this gap in recruitment from 2006 to 11 that we've been working our way across for several years now. So if we look in a little bit more detail, I'm going to focus in on the 032 or legal size weight per unit effort. And this allows us to make the most direct comparisons to the commercial fishery, because these are the same fish that are being landed in the commercial fishery. Here, I'm showing you the trend just as I did a couple slides ago from the coast-wide survey on the left, and comparing that to what's reported in the commercial fishery logbooks. Again, as Dr. Webster noted earlier, the banding here is the uncertainty in these estimates. And of course, the commercial fishery on average catches a much higher catch rate than the survey does, because the commercial fishery targets areas of high fish abundance where the survey fishes across the whole grid. But you can see that the trend between these two sources is very similar. At the time we compiled the data for the stock assessment, the fishery was still open, and we would expect to get more logs late in the season. We'll get additional logbooks even through next spring as we encounter some of those vessels that our port samplers may not have seen at the end of the season. When we do that, we generally see a slight reduction in the overall annual average catch rate that we estimate for the fishery. And so if we correct for that, compared to what we've seen in previous years, we would expect both of these series to agree almost exactly on an 18% decrease from 2021 to 2022. And of course, we do see year-to-year differences in the specific trends, but in aggregate, both of these sources of information are telling us the same thing. They track that long decline from the late 1990s or early 2000s through around 2010, and a relatively flat trend after that, with a fairly sharp decrease in 2022 to the lowest levels of catch rate that we've seen for both of these time series in recent years. So to provide a little bit more detail now, this is just survey data, and this is broken out across each individual IPHC regulatory area. And of course, the Pacific halibut stock is highly variable over time and over space. And so some areas we have seen much different trends in the last few years. Generally, Region 2 has shown less steep trends in the last few years. We've seen some sharper trends in certain areas. And I'll highlight here particularly Area 3A, where we saw the largest decrease. We saw a 37% decrease in catch rates in our fishery independent setline survey from 2021 to 2022. And that was the largest single decline that we saw on the coast. And because 3A represents the core of the stock and generally comprises the largest single component of the biomass across all regulatory areas, this is going to have a strong effect on the total. Now, I want to dive in a little bit deeper there particularly for IPHC regulatory area 3A, and just show you both the trend from the survey on the left and also the trends that we observed from the commercial fishery for fixed gear here in blue and for snap gear in red. And you'll see that although we didn't see quite as sharp a one-year decline from 2021 to 2022 in the fishery, if you look back 2 or 3 years, we've seen a pretty consistent trend here between both what we saw on our fishery independent setline survey and what's been seen in the fishery. And all three of these series end up being at their lowest point at the end of this time series. And this is going to speak in part to the variability in the distribution of this year class, this 2012 year class, as it's moved into the stock. We saw these fish, as you'll recall, a couple of years ago, we saw a fairly large increase. I'll go back here. We saw a fairly large increase in IPHC regulatory area 3B 2 years ago. And that was attributable to an increased encounter rate with these younger fish that seemed to show up first in 3B. The expectation as these fish get older is for them to spread out, and generally the older a year class gets, the more uniform its distribution gets across the stock. But I think what we're seeing this year is indicating that perhaps the 2012 year class is still showing a pretty high amount of variability in terms of its distribution. We're just not seeing it spreading more uniformly across the stock, at least yet, at 10 years of age. So this next slide just provides you with some even greater detail for the commercial fishery. So this breaks down for each IPHC regulatory area. It highlights some of the important components in the fishery, whether it's 2A, the tribal and the non-tribal fishery. Across most of the stock here, we've highlighted snap and fixed hook gear that comprise different components of the fleet that tend to be different size vessels, often targeting different areas within the stock. And then in 4C and 4D, we see some spatial differences there. This is just to provide you with a perspective on the amount of variability that we see across the stock. Even within an area, different gear types are encountering slightly different things on a year-to-year basis. And so in aggregate, however, all of these feed into, as I mentioned on the previous slide, a pretty good correspondence between what we're seeing on the survey over the long term and what we're seeing in the commercial fishery. I would note that the one exception where we're really seeing quite a different trend in recent years would be in area 2A, where the tribal fishery in 2A has seen increasing catch rates for a number of years running. And the non-tribal fishery, which occurs later in the season and is still a derby fishery, that the non-tribal fishery in 2A has continued to see declining catch rates. And fairly low catch rates over the last several years. But again, those fisheries occur in different places and at different times of the year. So we might expect there to be greater differences there than we might see in other areas and in other components of the overall fishery. If we look then at some of the biological observations from the fishery itself, this is the same information I showed you for the Fishery Independent Setline Survey just a minute ago, except that for most of these years, we don't have the information on male and female halibut at age. This because these fish are dressed at sea, and it's very difficult to tell males and females after they've been dressed at sea. However, beginning in 2017, we began collecting genetic samples from all of the fish that are sampled by our port samplers. And we now have a genetic assay that we can run back in the office to unequivocally tell males from females. It has effectively a 98 or better % accuracy rate. So from 2017 on, we can delineate males from females. And this was, of course, if you recall the 2019 assessment, this was very important information in structuring our understanding of how the fishery affected the stock. We were able to confirm that the fishery harvests approximately 80 to 85% females on an annual basis, which is not in itself necessarily a bad thing, but it's an important thing for us to know in order to account for the effect of the fishery on the stock. So here you see the males and females separated for that most recent time period. We will have the data from 2022 in time for next year's stock assessment. It takes a while to run those genetics, so we don't have that terminal year done yet, but I'll have that for next year. But what I do want to highlight here is the 2012 year class. So in 2022, this was the first year where we saw that the fishery, the most numerous age in the fishery catch coast-wide, all up and down the coast, was that 2012 year class. So essentially, imagine that fishery finally stepped across that gap in recruitment, and we're now fully committed to these younger fish. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it does represent a change. And I suspect many of you who were on the water this year noted a change in distribution of the fish, a change in the average size of the fish. It may have been harder to generate the same number of pounds because these fish are on average smaller than the 2005 and older fish that we've been seeing. And so it's going to take more fish to add up to the same amount of pounds over the course of the season. Now, we do still have some of that 2005 and older year classes in the stock. We expect to see them for another several years, but historically, the bulk of the commercial catch comes from approximately ages 8 to 16. Historically, that's roughly 80 or better % of the catch, going back all the way to 100 years. That's the age range that's produced the most for this stock. So as that 2005 year class is now 17 years old, we can expect their contribution overall to decrease. All that to say, looking forward, we can expect the commercial fishery to continue to encounter more of these young fish and rely heavily on the 2012 year class, and then of course whatever's coming along behind it as we start to get a better look at these younger year classes. Now, there is some good news in this year's results, and the good news is that we are starting to see some improvement in size at age. So this is our best reconstruction of size at age. This is just for female halibut, and I'm only showing a few ages here, spanning that range from ages 8 to 16, which again, these are the most important fish over the last 100 years to the commercial fishery. They're the female halibut, the fastest growing halibut, ages 8 to 16. And you can see here that these fish were fairly small back in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. They got very large for their age, moving into the late 1970s. A 16-year-old female in the late 1970s would have been around 70 pounds. And that same female today, we're looking at a fish that's down probably a little bit less than 30 pounds. So that's a huge change in size at age. I mean, that's almost twice as many fish coming over the rail to generate the same amount of yield. That's a very big change in the biology of this stock. And it's taken decades to play out. However, you can see at the end of this time series that the 8, 10, and 12-year-olds, we're starting to see some improvement in the size at age of those younger year classes. And in fact, for the 8-year-olds, we're seeing size at age that is comparable to pretty much anything we've seen in the time series. So that's good news. It's good news to see these younger fish growing, achieving larger body size at age. And in terms of the long-term prognosis, this is good news for the overall yield of the stock. However, note that this story takes decades to play out. So even if we continue on this positive trend, it's going to be quite a few years until we start to see a really strong contribution of some of these younger year classes to really buoying up the yield from the stock in terms of the weight of fish versus the numbers of fish that are being harvested. Nonetheless, it's good news over the medium to longer term. So I'll move now into the last set of results that we have from this year's data, and that is our estimates of stock distribution. So we estimate the stock distribution at a variety of different scales, from the regulatory area on up to biological regions. And the reason that I highlight biological regions is because our understanding of Pacific halibut has evolved over time to recognize that these fish are mobile, not just over their lifetime, but also within a calendar year. So as we've done more and more satellite tagging, what we're learning is that some of these fish are undergoing spawning migrations that might take them across the boundaries of 2 or even 3 different IPHC regulatory areas. And much of that transit time may be in the late fall and early spring when they're actually available to the fishery. So we can see fish moving pretty substantially compared to where we might count them in the summer. And so we really have tried to focus more on, biologically, on the distribution of the stock among regions as a more robust metric of what's really happening in the biology of the stock. And so these panels here show you the percent of the stock distributed in each of those 4 biological regions. Note that the axes differ on each of these panels. So it's the percent of the stock in that area, and they're zoomed in so you can better see. So for example, 4B in the left-hand corner, that's at around 5% of the overall stock, where region 3 in the upper right there, that's north of 50% of the overall stock. So note that we have plotted them on different axes. We had been seeing a long-term decline in the overall contribution of region 3 and a relative increase particularly in region 2 and to some degree in region 4, which started to turn around a bit in the last several years. So 2020 and 2021, we saw an increase in the stock distribution in region 3. But the decrease we saw in 2022, particularly in IPHC regulatory area 3A, has largely erased that trend, and we're back more or less where we were 3, 4, or 5 years ago. Still inside the historical envelope of observations. Now the stock distribution has also been evaluated in the context of management decisions, and so we also provided at the level of IPHC regulatory area. This is in fact the O32 stock distribution. And I provide this here just to provide some continuity with previous management assessments, which use the O32 stock distribution as one component. And I just highlight here that the decreases that we saw in IPHC regulatory area 3A and also in 4A, even though it was a little harder to see in that earlier plot, correspond to fairly large decreases overall. So we're gone from about a third of the stock estimated in 3A last year to closer to a quarter of the stock estimated in 3A in 2022. Now, of course, the three-year average will dampen that down somewhat, but still, those are fairly strong trends, particularly in 3A and 4A. Now, the last component of the data that we collect is our understanding of the ecosystem, the conditions that these fish are encountering across their distribution. We have known for a number of years that Pacific halibut recruitment, or the number of young fish entering the stock each year, has been correlated with the environmental conditions, particularly in the Gulf of Alaska. And generally the Pacific decadal oscillation, which is just a metric that generally describes the overall conditions in the Gulf of Alaska, when that index is positive, we have historically seen a slightly higher average recruitment for Pacific halibut. It doesn't predict each individual year class well at all, but over the long term, when the PDO is positive, we tend to see, on average, better recruitment. And when it's negative, we tend to see more poor recruitment. So here, this is a figure of the PDO index itself, and you can see that somewhere around 2006, we saw a transition from what had been a positive period into a negative period, and that persisted through approximately 2014. And then from 2014 to 19, we again saw some positive conditions in the Pacific decadal oscillation. Now, this doesn't tell us that those are necessarily going to be good recruitments, but unfortunately, it's the only information that we have at this point that gives us any insight into that moving forward. I would also provide some caution that while this was a very coherent index historically, there's some emerging research looking at the correlation between the PDO and a variety of other environmental indices in the North Pacific. And some of that work suggests that some of the relationships seem to be breaking down as these ecosystems have shown some change in the last decade or two. Basically, all the predictability of these systems is becoming lower. And things that used to go together, we'd see circulation pattern and warm water going together. Well, now those things seem to be more likely out of phase. So all that to say, we think that there was a period of perhaps more favorable conditions from 2014 to through 2019, but we don't know with any certainty whether that is going to correspond necessarily to better Pacific halibut recruitment. We also draw heavily on the work of a variety of scientists across the North Pacific, National Marine Fisheries Service, Department of Fisheries and Oceans, state agencies. The IPHC doesn't have the resources to do a full ecosystem survey, but we rely heavily on the work done by others. And what we've seen in the last several years is actually good news. We've seen both in the Bering Sea and the Gulf of Alaska, we've seen a return to somewhat more normal conditions after some very warm years, some years with reduced ice cover in the Bering Sea and a very strong heat wave from 2014 to approximately 2016 in the Gulf of Alaska. We're still seeing some warmer temperatures in the Aleutian Islands, and we're still seeing more volatility in all of these parts of the overall halibut distribution than we did historically. Looking a little bit farther south, we're also seeing some continued challenges in the ecosystems off the British Columbia coast and down into the California current. Although particularly in the California current, we have seen some cooler water, which corresponds in that area to increased productivity. So we would like to understand better how each of these factors might or might not correspond to Pacific halibut growth and mortality. And those are things that are an important aspect of our ongoing research project. At this point, I think the takeaway from our understanding of what's going on in the ecosystems is just that there's a high amount of variability. And perhaps relative to our historical observations, there may be less predictability in terms of what we see in the ecosystem compared to what we see in the stock moving forward. And as many of you know, the response to some of the volatility, particularly in the Gulf of Alaska, the response across different species has been quite varied. So we saw Pacific cod in the Gulf of Alaska did not do well under the warmer water, but sablefish or black cod did quite well, had some years of very good recruitment. As we move forward in time, we will learn more about the response of Pacific halibut to these same conditions. I would expect within the next 2 to 3 years, we'll have a much better estimate of the 2014 year class for Pacific halibut. And that'll start to give us some insight of whether these warmer conditions were favorable or not for Pacific halibut. And there are, if you go to this presentation online, there are some links that lead you to much more in-depth reports on these. There's several hundred pages of additional information here provided in these links. I really can't do it justice in a single slide. Okay, so that concludes my summary of the data that we have from 2022. And now I'm going to move into the modeling results. And by way of summary, there's the biggest change in 2022 was that we estimated natural mortality in one additional model out of the 4 models that we used to describe the stock. And this has corresponded to larger projected yields at our long-term fishery reference points. For example, our F43 reference point corresponds to a somewhat larger yield in the near term than we have seen it from past stock assessments. However, the spawning biomass estimate has been quite stable across recent stock assessments. And the big change here is that we are seeing a change within the spawning biomass from these older year classes to the 2012 year class. And that's going to be quite important as we move forward into the future. Similar to previous assessments, our best estimate of the surplus production, or the amount of yield that we can take out of the stock without appreciably changing the biomass, is quite close to where we've been in the last several years, both in terms of that calculation and the status quo mortality limits, just a little bit over 40 million pounds. So now I'll give you a bit more detail into that. So just to remind you, the Pacific halibut stock assessment is comprised of 4 individual stock assessment models, and these represent different ways to model the underlying population dynamics. We don't know exactly how the Pacific halibut stock works, and so we create several different ways in which it may work, and we use an average of all of those to provide a slightly more stable and more robust way to assess the stock on a year-to-year basis. And what we've seen over the last decade of using this approach is that some years we might have one model that responds a little bit more positively than the others, and then the next year, that model might be down a little bit. And what this has done is it's provided some additional stability to our overall process, because our estimate of spawning biomass tends to change a bit less using the average of these 4 models, which are all reasonable models on their own, than if we had just picked one and sort of lived with the ups and downs of that single model. So it's been a pretty stabilizing effect overall on the Pacific halibut stock assessment. Now, the cycle that we are on is that 2022 was a full analysis. So we had updated the stock assessment in 2020 and 2021. And so after 2 years of updates, it was time for another full analysis. Our general schedule is that every 3 years, we do a full analysis where we reevaluate all of the components in the data sets that go into these models. We reevaluate any assumptions that are hardwired into these models. As Dr. Cox mentioned earlier, we investigate some of the statistical properties of the models, the ways in which we treat the data. We basically go through them all with a fine-tooth comb, and we make any improvements that we deem are necessary. And we do this in close conjunction with our scientific review. So as Dr. Cox mentioned earlier, we do most of this work in the spring. We present it to the Scientific Review Board in June for their evaluation. We go through all the detail that we can go through. They provide some feedback, and we make changes in response to the recommendations from our scientific review. And then in September, we go through and make sure that those changes worked and everything is looking good. And that's the point in which we finalize the stock assessment for the upcoming cycle, is in September. Then after that, we just add the data. We don't make any further changes to the model itself. So we went through that process this year, and we made a number of improvements to the model, and I spoke to some of those at the interim meeting, but I'm not going to go back through them all now. I want to highlight the most important change that we made, which was estimating female natural mortality in one more of the 4 models. So we had already been estimating natural mortality rate in 2 of the 4 models. We're now estimating it in 3. And you can imagine if we have 2 at one value and 2 at another value, we're taking the average, it's somewhere in the middle. And now if we have 3 models that are all at one value, the average is going to be pretty much like those 3. And that's the change that you're seeing in the assessment results, is we've shifted one model, and now the average across the 4 is representing the estimated value of natural mortality by and large, rather than the fixed value that was there before. Now, I realize you may need a little bit of description, a little bit of background on natural mortality. So what is natural mortality? Natural mortality is the rate at which these fish die from anything other than us catching them. So whether it's disease or old age or predators, this is all of the other reasons why fish die. And to be honest, we don't know all of the factors that cause halibut mortality beyond fishing in a particular year. How do we estimate this in the model? It's not something we can cut open a fish and measure. So the way we estimate this is that we track each year class. So we know, okay, we have a bunch of fish that were born in a particular year. We see their abundance over time, and over time, those fish disappear slowly over a period of a couple decades. And we keep track of how many fish we caught at each age, and we subtract those out, and we can see how fast each year class was going down even after we accounted for the amount that we caught. And the rate at which they're declining, that's the rate of natural mortality. So you can imagine if we do this for one year class and you do it for another year class, well, they're not going to have exactly the same rate of mortality. But if we do it for, say, 10-year classes or 20 or 30 or 40-year classes, now all of a sudden we get a pretty good estimate of the average rate of decline of these fish, even beyond fishing. So that's how we estimate it inside the stock assessment models. And as you might imagine, the more data we have, the better the estimate that we get. So when we have 2 models that have 100 years of age data in them, we get a very good estimate of natural mortality. We have 2 shorter models, and for a period of years, it was challenging to estimate natural mortality in those models. But now, as those time series grow, we're getting more and more information, more and more ability to estimate that right in these models, rather than making some assumption based on what we think we might know outside the models. So how does natural mortality affect productivity of the stock? The higher the rate of natural mortality, the higher the productivity, or the higher the turnover of the stock is. And that means the higher the rate of fishing that would be sustainable on that stock. So if you imagine a herring that only lives a few years, well, you can fish that quite heavily because those fish are going to be turning over naturally. They're going to be constantly being replaced by new fish. On the other extreme, you're going to have something like a very long-lived rockfish that might live for 150 years. Those fish you have to fish at a very low rate because there's almost no new fish moving in and replacing the fish that are already in the stock. That species is counting on being there for 100 years in order to replace itself. Well, Pacific halibut is somewhere in the middle. We have a natural mortality rate that's actually closer to a herring than a rockfish, but really not like a herring. It's kind of right in the middle of those 2 species. And so that spectrum is what determines how we understand what a sustainable fishing rate would be. So a little bit of history. Prior to 1998, Pacific halibut models dating all the way back to the 70s used a value of natural mortality of 0.2. And it was periodically estimated and or fixed, but that seemed most consistent with the data at the time. In 1998, a change was made to set that back, basically to dial it back to a value of 0.15. And I'll speak to that change in 1998 in a minute. But to finish out the history, that value was used without really reevaluating it at all from 1998 through 2012. In 2012, we began to recognize that A, natural mortality was a very important component of our understanding of the dynamics, and B, that we might be able to do a little bit better than just sort of making a fixed assumption and sticking with it. And so in 2013, we developed a model that could estimate natural mortality. We included that in the suite of models that we used in that year. In 2014, we added a second model that was able to estimate natural mortality. And now in 2022, we've made another breakthrough, and now we're able to estimate natural mortality in a third model. So now we're at the point where we're estimating natural mortality in 3 out of the 4 models. And all 3 of the models that we're estimating suggest a value that is quite a bit higher than the value of 0.15 that was used in previous years. To give you a scale, it's an instantaneous rate, so it's not exactly a proportion of fish dying, but as a first approximation, you could imagine that this is roughly the percent of fish that die on an annual basis. So we're talking about, do 15% of them die every year to natural causes, or do 20% of them die? And that little bit of a difference makes a difference in our understanding of the productivity of the stock. So to go back to 1998 for a second, at that time, the stock was going up, the quotas were quite large, and there was some concern that using a value of 0.2 might be a little bit too aggressive. And so there was a choice made to use a lower value with the acknowledgement that that was a precautionary step, that it was more precautionary to use a lower value of natural mortality. It had a strong effect on the abundance estimate and the level of productivity that could be taken out of the stock. And that essentially it was a layer of precaution that was built in. And this was appropriate at the time. This was consistent and very transparent. These are quotes from the reports from 1998 as they were presented at that time. However, moving forward now, we have an additional 25 years of data to evaluate this. So imagine that's 25 years of additional year classes that we have watched grow and decline through the stock, and we've learned more about it. So we can now, rather than making a fixed assumption, we can estimate natural mortality from the data. This also, I think importantly, and dating back even to our performance review in 2012, which suggested that it was very important for us to do our best to provide transparent and risk-neutral science, to not build in adjustments to the science itself, but to present that information for decision-making, and to provide our best estimate of the stock trends. And so that's really what this change, it has 2 parts. One, it's better informed by data, and 2, we're removing this precautionary adjustment that was essentially built into the stock assessment for that period of years. And unequivocally, and with agreement from our scientific review, estimating natural mortality rather than using an arbitrarily assumed value represents the best science that we have available. So this is our best estimate of the productivity of the stock. So in that regard, this is definitely a step forward for the stock assessment, recognizing that it is a change and it takes some time to get used to. So moving into the results now. So these are the time series that are estimated from each of the 4 stock assessment models. The models don't all agree on exactly how much biomass was in the stock. We don't know exactly how large the stock got in the late 1990s, but we know it was considerably larger than it has been over the last couple of decades. As I mentioned, when we looked at the catch, we had a much larger stock in the late 1990s and early 2000s, and then the spawning biomass began to decline. And this was largely a function of lower recruitments after that period of very high productivity in the 1980s. We hit a low point somewhere around 2011 or 2012, and then the spawning biomass increased for a few years, and that was a function of the 2005 year class maturing. And so we saw a small peak there around 2017. And then since 2017, we've seen a slow decline in the spawning biomass, primarily as a function of these weak recruitments that we had from 2006 to 2011 working their way through and into the spawning biomass. And so a couple takeaways here. One, this agrees quite closely with the raw data, the trend in the survey and the trend in the fishery catch rates. And 2, things don't happen really fast in terms of the spawning biomass of Pacific halibut. This is a fairly slow trend, even at a time period like this where we're relying on the 2012 year class. These fish live a long time, and the dynamics are relatively slow. So the change that we see in spawning biomass tends to be slower change. So if we compare back then to the most recent decade of stock assessments, each of those assessments is shown here as a black line. The blue shaded area represents this year's stock assessment and the uncertainty associated with it. And each of those red dots represents the terminal estimate from one of the last decade of stock assessments. So that's each year, that's where we thought we were, each of those red dots. And so you can see, despite the improvements we've made in the stock assessment and the changes we've made this year, we still have very close agreement with this overall trend of some increase in the spawning biomass until about 2017, and then a slow decrease after that time period. But, you know, in aggregate, we've had about the same amount of spawning biomass of Pacific halibut for approaching 15 years now. Since at least 2010, we've had effectively the same amount of spawning biomass overall. Now, the biggest driver of these trends has been recruitment. And so here what I'm showing you is the estimates of recruitment from each of the 4 models. I've divided each one by its average so we can see not so much on an absolute scale, but to see which, in a relative sense, which are the better year classes and which are the weaker year classes. And the 2005 year class is the best year class we've seen since the early 1990s. I'm not going all the way back through the time series because these are, realistically, these are the year classes that are still present in any appreciable amount in the stock. So we had a pretty decent year class in 2005. After that, you can see we have 6 low years in a row. And these are the 6 worst years in this several decades. And then we now have a pretty good estimate of the 2012 year class, which is much better than the 6 years before it, but not quite as large as the 2005 year class. If you recall my presentations from 2 and 3 years ago, we weren't sure how big this year class was going to turn out to be. We had a couple of years where it looked like it might be almost as big as 2005. And now that estimate's kind of settled down, and we're getting, I think it's unlikely that we're going to become more optimistic about this 2012 year class over time. It's going to be better than what we had from 2006 to 2011, but it's probably not going to turn out to be as big as it was as the 2005 year class. After 2012, things become much more uncertain. We're getting a decent read on 2013, and it doesn't look great. So I wouldn't expect 2013 to look any better as we move forward. 2014 and onward, we really haven't seen these fish enough in the survey or in the fishery yet to get a solid estimate of those year classes. Now, I want to put this 6-year period of recruitment into some context. And if we take just the 2 models that recreate the longer time series, and we look a little bit farther back, we can get a sense of how recruitment has varied over time. You quickly see the 1987 year class, which we think was close to twice as big as any other year class in that 100-year time period. It was a great year class for the stock. And I wish we could explain why that particular year was so good, but we don't know. But here I'm highlighting those 6 low years. And if you just trace your way back across that plot, you can see that we haven't had 6 low years in a row like that since sometime in the late 1960s or early 1970s. So I don't want to, I don't want to understate how poor that is to get 6 bad recruitments in a row like that. And that's really the biggest influence on the current productivity of the stock. That's why we've seen continued low surplus production over the last few years, is because we're trying to get through a really big gap in recruitment, a gap that we really haven't seen in several decades. Okay, I'm now going to move into our estimates of fishing intensity. So this is much less related to the data and much more related to our understanding of the productivity of the stock. What this figure is showing you is a fishing intensity on the y-axis. So the harder you fish, the higher you are on this figure. Each of those black lines is a previous stock assessment, and each of the red dots is our estimate of where we were for an upcoming year. So each red dot corresponds to the limits that were set and what we thought that was going to correspond to in terms of fishing intensity. So again, the black lines are previous assessments. The red dots are the projections of the adopted limits for the upcoming year. And in green there, I'm showing for recent years where we had a specified reference level, I'm showing you the reference level of fishing intensity, first F46, and then more recently F43. And these were levels of fishing that at the time, we understood to be relatively consistent with our long-term objectives for the stock. So if I put this year's stock assessment on top, in blue, the blue banding shows you the uncertainty associated with this year's assessment, and the blue line shows you our best estimate or the point estimate of fishing intensity over this whole time series. And there's a few takeaways here. The first is that we have and we still think that during that period from the early 2000s through about 2012 or 13, we were fishing this stock very hard, probably harder than we should have been and probably harder than we thought we were at the time. The fishing intensity was higher. In retrospect, we now realize we're fishing the stock quite hard during that time period. But we didn't know that at the time. The other thing you can take away here is that generally over this time series, although the trend is quite similar, that blue line is generally below previous assessments. So in light of the better estimate of natural mortality, we now understand that maybe we've been fishing this stock at a little bit lower intensity than we thought historically. So in some regards, that's good news, right? The stock is a little more productive than we thought. However, in the near term, just to orient you before I go into the last point here, our point estimate for 2022 is that we've been fishing the stock at an F51%. So that means that we're fishing the stock at a level that would reduce the spawning biomass to 51% of what we would have if we weren't fishing on the stock on a per recruit basis. For the most recent years, we have generally, and here I'm highlighting this period where we've generally been now, our understanding suggests that we've been fishing at a lower intensity than we thought we were for the last several years. And so this is a mixed bag here, because it's, in some regards, it's good that we've been fishing the stock a little bit less hard than we thought, but it also means that the trends that we've seen have been occurring at an even lower fishing intensity. So we've seen the spawning biomass declining, and yet it's been declining at actually even a little lower fishing intensity than we thought we were exerting on the stock. So what that means is that the stock has actually been a little less productive most recently than we thought it was. So not 100% good news there, but this is we think a better estimate in the long term of the productivity of the stock. And it doesn't change our general perception of the history of exploitation of this stock. So if we now compare to our spawning biomass relative to our reference point, so we compare our spawning biomass to the spawning biomass that would occur in a particular year if we hadn't been fishing on the stock. And we have a couple of reference points here. The first is SB 30%. So this is 30% of the spawning biomass that we would have had we not been fishing on the stock. The second is SB 20%. And this is where we would consider being in the conservation zone. So this is where we don't want the stock to drop below 20% of the stock size that we would have had we not been fishing on the stock. The blue line and the blue banding indicates our best estimate from this year's stock assessment, which is suggesting that we're at 42% of the stock size that we would have had in 2022 had we not been fishing on the stock. And that we've actually been improving that a little bit over the last several years, that the relative spawning biomass has been going up. Now, I just told you that the absolute spawning biomass has been going down slightly over this same period of years. So how do we reconcile this? We reconcile this with the fact that the black line here on the top, this is the spawning biomass, and the black line represents what we think the stock would have been doing had we not been fishing on the stock. So we expect that period from 2000 to around 2010 or 12, stock would have been going down no matter what we did. Whether we were fishing or not, the stock would have been going down. Then it would have flattened out a bit, and then it would have gone down again in response to these very low recruitments from 2006 to 2011 that we've seen. But the actual trend that we estimate, the blue line at the bottom there, is a bit flatter over the recent years. And so that reflects the fact that we have responded with management by reducing the catch limits from what we had earlier on and easing this trend a bit in the fished stock relative to what we think would have been there had we not been fishing. And so it's the difference in these trends that allows us to see an increase in our relative biomass, even though the absolute biomass is at a lower level. Okay, that leads me into the last section of this presentation, which is the projections and a quick discussion of the decision table. So recall from previous years, we haven't changed any of the basic methods that we use here. We project for the next 3 years a constant TCEY, and that corresponds to a level of total mortality. We provide a range of different mortality levels from no fishing whatsoever all the way up to some higher value, in this case 60 million pounds, and some additional detail at levels between fishing intensities of F40% and F46%, which have been found through our management strategy evaluation process, which you'll hear more about tomorrow, to be largely consistent with our long-term goals for the stock. So we've learned through simulation experiments that if we fish generally in the level of F40 to F46, over the long term, we're going to be meeting our fishery objectives. However, in the short term, we also provide some additional metrics. So we provide, in addition to that F43% and those other alternatives, we also provide the 3-year surplus, which gives us a 50-50 chance of staying even where we are in terms of spawning biomass. We provide an option which is the status quo, or last year's mortality limits, which were 41.2 million pounds, and then a few options just to bracket, going down a little bit below the status quo. So graphically, beginning with no fishing, this figure shows you the projection over the next 3 years of what we would expect to happen to the spawning biomass if there were no fishing mortality from any fisheries, directed or non-directed whatsoever. And what you can see here is that because halibut dynamics are relatively slow, and because we already have some weak year classes in the pipeline, we're not going to see a huge change in the stock over a 3-year period, even if we weren't fishing at all. About the best we could do would be to get back to roughly where we were in 2016 or 17 over the next few years. And again, that would be with no fishing whatsoever. The 3-year surplus this year is estimated to be at 43 million pounds. And so what that means is that 3 years out, with a TCEY of 43 million pounds over the next 3 years, we would have a 50-50 chance of having exactly the same spawning biomass, or having a spawning biomass that's no smaller than the spawning biomass we have right now. So 50% above, 50% below. And that surplus production calculation has varied quite a bit over the last few years. So here, this figure shows you in red the actual mortality going back to the 1990s, and then in blue, the surplus production in terms of the TCEY, and in gray, the surplus production in terms of the total mortality, just because we didn't have the calculation there for TCEY going quite so far back. But the two are generally in good agreement. And what you can see is that we had surplus production that was pretty close to the actual mortality in that period around 2015, 16, and that was the time period when the stock was going up, right? So the stock, we took out about the same amount out of the stock that the stock was growing, and so the stock was increasing slightly or at least holding steady. And that's what surplus production means. If we took all the surplus production, it's like taking the interest out of a bank account. You take all the interest in a particular year, and you have the same balance next year that you had this year. If you take more than the interest, then your account goes down. If you take less, then that interest accrues, and you have a slightly larger stock next year. You see that period after 2017, for several years, we had much lower estimates of surplus production. This is right in the middle of that effect of those weak year classes working their way through the spawning biomass. And then as we start to get to the other side, the 2012 year class is estimated, we can see it coming, we start to see an increase in the surplus production. And this year's estimate's actually only a little bit bigger than last year's estimate of surplus production, both of them right around 40 million pounds. Last year slightly under, this year a little bit higher at 43 million pounds. So this picture really hasn't been strongly affected by any of the changes that we've made in the assessment in the last few years. Okay, at the reference level, or an F43 level of fishing intensity, that would correspond to 52 million pounds this year. Again, that's the level that we think would meet our objectives over the long term. But you can see that would be quite a jump from the status quo, and that would correspond to a much higher probability of stock decline. And we don't estimate that would push the stock off a cliff. We don't estimate it would be a steep decline, but it would have a much higher probability of decline. And I'll go into some of the specific probabilities here just to give you a sense of that when I get through the decision table. And that does lead us to the decision table. And the decision table is really a place where you can look for the trade-off between yield and the chance of something bad happening, whether that's a decline in the stock, a decrease in the fishery trend, or a change with regard to status in relation to our reference points. And the decision table is framed around this long-term fishing intensity of F43% and relative to our SB30 and our SB20 control rules. So the top of the decision table provides the various yield options, ranging from no fishing on the far left to a high level of fishing mortality on the right. We have that band of F40 through F46, which again corresponds to a range of fishing that would likely meet our objectives over the long term. And then we also, with F43 there in the center, and then we also have the 3-year surplus calculation, the status quo, which is just last year's quota. We always include that one in there. And then again, some range of values just to start to see some contrast across this table. And I provide the full table here, but rather than try and call out particular numbers here, I'll just tell you generally, so the yield options are across the top, and each cell in the table corresponds to the chance of that particular thing happening, whether it's the stock trend going down or moving below a particular fishery reference point. So I'm just going to take a couple slices out of this table to illustrate to you how these probabilities change over a range of yields. So here from top to bottom, I'm showing you 4 different levels of yield from F43% to the 3-year surplus, which is 43 million pounds, to the status quo, to something below the status quo. And if we just look at the probability of stock decline, at 52 million pounds, we have roughly a 3 out of 4 chance that the spawning biomass is going to go down, whether that's 1 year or 3 years out. As we go down to the 3-year surplus, now we have a 53% chance of a 1-year decline, and by definition, we have a 50-50 chance of a 3-year decline in the spawning biomass. At 41.2 million pounds, we're now just a little bit below 50% chance of stock decline. And if we go all the way down to 35 million pounds, you can see we've gone from roughly 3 out of 4 to roughly 1 out of 3 chance of stock decline over the next 1 to 3 years. And so this is where you can start to see the effect of management. So the choices that are made at this meeting, this is the range that we're likely to see the effect of fishing on the stock over the next 3 years. Across a pretty broad range of TCEYs, this is the feedback into the projected stock dynamics. So those are the risks that we quantify through the stock assessment, but there are a few additional things that I want to touch on, some additional risks that we really can't quantify. And the first is more of a fishery consideration in terms of the fact that we observe that 2022 was the lowest fishery performance and efficiency that we've seen. It's the lowest catch rates coast-wide and in many individual areas that we've seen over the last 30 years. And we don't have a good way to capture what does that mean to the fishery. So I think that's definitely a consideration for this week is, what does that mean to be at those low fishery catch rates? Is that if that's acceptable, then that's where we are, and that's relevant to the decision. But we just note that is the lowest that we've observed in that time period. Another risk that's not well quantified in the decision table is that we have transitioned from several year classes. We had contributions from 99 through 2005. We've transitioned into a stock that is going to be increasingly reliant on a single year class, the 2012 year class. As those older fish die off, we're really putting all our eggs in the 2012 year class for the next couple of years, at least till we see what's coming behind it. And that year class is only about 1/3 mature right now. Only about 1/3 of those fish we estimate to be mature. So we're going to be relying on, and the projections that I've just shown you rely on those fish continuing to mature over the next 3 years. To give you a graphical representation of that, this is our best estimate of the maturity schedule of halibut with age across the x-axis and proportion mature on the y-axis, noting that about half of Pacific halibut are mature, female Pacific halibut are mature between 11 and 12 years old. So this is where the 2012 year class was this year or last year now in 2022, about 1/3 of them mature. And by 2025, we're expecting about 2/3 of them to be mature. And we're counting on them moving up this curve on schedule to maintain the spawning biomass over the next several years. Normally, we wouldn't worry too much if a year class is a little bit behind or ahead of this schedule because we would have multiple year classes stacked up in the stock. And so if 1 or 2 were behind and 1 or 2 were ahead, well, it would all sort of come out in the wash. This year, however, and for the next couple of years, we're really relying on more or less a single year class. And so it is important whether this year class gets above or ahead or behind the maturity schedule. And as you heard in the 5-year research plan, as you hear from Dr. Planis, we've prioritized investigating maturity as one of our highest research priorities, but we won't have that information in time to really tell us about what to do in the next couple of years with regard to this year class. So by the time we get renewed estimates of maturity, we're largely going to be past this little bottleneck that we're in now, assuming that we get some more year classes filling in over the next few years. So this is a consideration we're kind of in a unique situation with regard to this single year class and its contribution to spawning biomass over the next several years. The last of the risks are just due to the fact that the stock is at what I would call an unprecedented low population size in terms of actual numbers of fish. So we see that in a relative sense, we're not doing too bad. We don't think this is going to invoke a conservation concern necessarily. But in terms of the actual number and biomass of fish in the water, it's as low as we've seen in a long time. And it's worth remembering that. Even though we think the stock would have been low without fishing, it's pretty low at present. And what that means is that what we're seeing right now is lower productivity than we would expect to see in the long term. When Dr. Hicks does long-term projections of the stock, pretty infrequently does the stock actually go any lower than we're seeing right now. Almost all the scenarios look better in the long term than we're seeing right now. And that's because we're at relatively low weighted age, and we've just had these 6 poor recruitments in a row, which is pretty atypical. I mean, we wouldn't expect to see, it's like flipping coins and getting a whole bunch of tails in a row. We wouldn't expect to see it very often, but we're in it right now. So that's the situation. That's the current situation relative to our long-term understanding of the dynamics of the stock. We are in a bit of a unique place. And then as I spoke to earlier with regard to the ecosystem and just the variability that we've seen in the climate and in response of other species, we're at a point right now that is somewhat unique in terms of the variability and just the uncertainty associated with the uncertainty associated with the ecosystem that these fish live in. I think we're all recognizing that there's been a lot more change and a lot more rapid change in these ecosystems than we thought there would be, even looking back 5 or 10 years back. So those are things that we don't do a good job quantifying and are probably worth considering. I'm going to finish out just by putting this in a bit of context. So this table shows you the reference TCEYs as calculated by whatever management procedure was in place at the time, going all the way back to the blue line, if you remember that in some of the earlier years, and then a reference level of F46, and then a reference level of F43, and just showing you the calculations each year and how much those have varied. And just noting that we do see a fair bit of variability. The assessment goes up and down year to year. Some years it goes up, some years it goes down. And even though this year's change is fairly large at 26%, different from last year's reference calculation, it's actually not even the largest in this recent time series. And then also just showing you on the bottom there the adopted catch limits, or the coast-wide TCEYs that were adopted in each of those years, and just noting that generally we don't see quite as much variability in the adopted limits as we see in the reference calculation on an annual basis. And that's been fairly consistent over this whole time series. The reference level over this period has varied by, on average, 14% per year. And the adopted catch limit, I believe, has varied by approximately 7% over this same time period. So just to put this year's results in a little bit of context with previous decisions and calculations. Now, I will be, as I've done in the past, I will be providing detailed mortality projections as needed during this meeting if there are requests at the conference board or the PAB or the commissioners. But I note that last week we did update the website, and so the mortality projection tool is available for your use. You'll need to specify a coast-wide TCEY and a distribution for that TCEY. But after you've done that, you'll see that it will provide a detailed distribution within each IPHC regulatory area down to individual sectors, so you can see how a particular TCEY would correspond to individual sector limits. And that tool importantly includes the end of year non-directed discards or bycatch estimates, so you can see how our best estimates of bycatch feed into the projections. It includes the updated commercial fishery discard rates that we saw in 2022, so that's accounted for there. Updated subsistence values where we had them, unguided recreational fishing, all of those components that are important to the projections have been updated there. So feel free to go ahead and put some values in just to see how those projections look, if you'd like to during this week. And again, I'll be creating additional alternatives as needed for this week's process. And so with that, just the recommendation is just to note this presentation, and I'd be happy to answer questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Stewart. Questions? Neil?
Thank you for the walkthrough, Dr. Stewart. I have a couple questions, a bit of feedback. I wondered about the new mortality estimates. And the question that I was thinking about as you were presenting today was, as time passes, do you have thoughts about how we might evaluate the assumptions or the estimates we're making about how productive the stock is, and whether it is as productive as the change to the one natural mortality estimate might suggest? Just, sort of, I'm thinking as time goes by, there may be a general interest, like, is it turning out the way we thought it would by virtue of having made these changes to the natural mortality estimate?
Yes, thank you, Commissioner. I appreciate the question. And it's a good one. It is something we track in the stock assessment. So as time goes on, one of the things we watch for is whether parameter estimates are trending, are changing over time. As we add more data, are we continually revising our estimate downward or upward? That tells us that it's to some degree either misspecified or the productivity itself is changing over time. And so that is exactly how we would diagnose how reliable these estimates are. And I will say that we have 7 or 8 years of estimating natural mortality in 2 of these models, and we've seen those estimates quite stable over time. So as we've added new data, we've not appreciably updated our understanding, at least in those 2 models, and recognizing we do have uncertainty about the whole stock. I will also note that productivity really comes in 2 forms for the Pacific halibut stock. Well, really 3 components. There's one component is the rate of natural mortality and how fast the turnover is. A second component is growth rates and the size and age of fish, and that one we can track fairly empirically right through the data. And then the third one is recruitment, and although it's lagged, we have to wait a few years to see recruitments coming into the stock. We can pretty effectively even track that right in the data. I mean, if we just look at the age composition, we can see these year classes coming. So 2 out of the 3 drivers, we can really, we get a good check right in the raw data, and then the models basically just tell us what we're seeing in the data. And then for natural mortality, our approach is to watch for trends in that parameter over time. And so I would expect that's something we will continue to keep an eye on. And I will note that it wasn't brought up earlier in the Scientific Review Board report, but one of the priorities that they've provided to us for the next couple of years is to continue to investigate the 4th model, where we still are using a fixed assumption for natural mortality, find out what it would take to estimate it in that model and see what that model would tell us about it as well. So that is high on our list of quantitative research avenues.
Thank you. You anticipated my second question about the last model, so I have no more questions. Thanks.
Thanks, Neil. John?
Thanks, Dr. Stewart. I learn something new every time I hear this presentation, so I appreciate that. I want to ask you about, you mentioned the long period of low recruitment here, and I wonder if there's anything you can say about kind of the periodicity of large year classes. You mentioned 98, 2005, 2012 being big. Do we have a long enough data set to draw any conclusions on the likelihood of other big year classes coming, or do we just not have the data to do that?
Thank you for the question, Commissioner. One of the things I didn't have time to really go into detail today, we spent a considerable amount of time as part of this full stock assessment looking at the relationship between recruitment and the environment and trying to squeeze some more information out of that relationship to better predict individual recruitments rather than just sort of periods of higher and lower recruitment. And I'm disappointed to result we couldn't do any better than just, on average, it does a little better when the conditions are, the PDO is positive, and a little poorer when it's negative. Our ability to predict individual year classes is disappointingly low. It's a priority, and we're tackling it sort of from the ground up. So Dr. Planis will probably speak tomorrow about a research project looking at larval distribution. So we decided to sort of back up all the way to the egg and larval stage and work our way forward and just see what we can learn about each of these stages. And that particular project is looking at how the environment and particularly current patterns affect the advection of larvae to different areas. And so we're sort of systematically working through different life history stages to try and understand where those critical bottlenecks are. But the short answer to your question is we don't really understand what drives good and bad recruitments. We see them when they happen, but we don't know why.
Okay, understood, thanks. And then as a follow-up, perhaps I should know this, but do oceanographers make predictions about PDO, and do we have a sense of that as an indicator of what we might see?
Yes, so there's no formal prediction of PDO. Most of the indicators and things the predictions are no more than 6 to 12 months out. I know that a lot of oceanographers are working on it. They have some pretty detailed models, and they can make predictions on the scale of decades, like, generally what are things going to look like a long way down the road, and they can make a pretty good short-term prediction of a few months, but that in between where we really care about it is a very hard length of time for them to predict. I think that's where those models are not all that useful yet.
Bob?
Yes, Dr. Stewart, the graphic you showed of the survey coastwide dropping 18%, I'm thinking that that's reflective of the 032, which is the spawning age or size of our resource here, and it's down 18%. And our survey surely is targeting not just the 2012 year class, but all year classes out there of that age. But yet you indicated the spawning biomass was stable at about 200 million pounds, I think. I've always thought that the survey was an index helped index what the spawning biomass was doing. And I'm getting a sense I'm wrong on that. So I'm having trouble with your comment that it's static when we have an 18% drop.
Yeah, thank you, Commissioner, for the question. So, I mean, in a general sense, the survey is often an index of the spawning biomass, but there's a couple of additional factors. So one is that there are a lot of male halibut out there, some of which are above 32 inches, not as many as we'd like, but some of which are above 32 inches in length. Also, the spawning biomass is largely fish that are 11 to 12 years old and older. Yet the fishery accesses a lot of fish that are as young as 8 years old. And so some of these trends, there are some lags in here where we don't see the effect as strongly or at the exact same time in the spawning biomass as we would in the fishery. So the fishery is accessing, even the 032 index, the survey or the fishery is accessing a much broader demographic than the spawning biomass, which in my graphics is just the female spawning biomass. And that's largely going to be reflecting fish of 12 years and up. So the fishery, roughly half the fishery catch is fish that are not mature yet. And that's been the case for decades. That's always been the case in the fishery. And that's why we can see some different trends. And it's particularly pronounced right now because we have this gap in recruitment that's affecting a whole bunch of year classes together. And we're seeing a more pronounced effect on those younger females and the males and the mature females combined than we are on just the mature females.
Richard?
Yes, Dr. Stewart. I'm trying to get a sense of the level of concern we should have with the data that we've gotten this year. So you mentioned that the spawning biomass is as lowest it's ever been, but you also mentioned some positive trends that pretty much indicated to me that the future's looking bright. We have size of ages doing this new information about the the productivity of the stock is, good information. And so and the potential decision that the commission might make of not fishing at the intensity that we normally have picked at SPR 43, we might ease back on the intensity. So there's a lot of things that we might be doing that might, lessen the concern that we're in a critical point that we're going to fall off a cliff. I think the knee-jerk reaction has been that while we had low fisheries results. I mean, the ability to be efficient in the fishery, or it could be just the fish weren't there, and that by somehow changing our intensity, that we may be laying off this particular age of class that we are hoping is going to sustain us in the future. So I guess it's two parts to my question. One is there, what level of concern should we have about the information we got this year as far as needing to do something like immediately? And second, even if we lessened our fishing intensity below even our last year's status quo or a 3-year, average surplus, is that going to necessarily mean that we could tactically reduce our pressure on this incoming class? I'm sure the makeup of all the harvests are classes that go across the board, but can we just say that if we really become conservative and reduce our harvest intensity, that we're going to definitely lay off of this 2012 class next year? So I'm just trying to get a sense of concern and what we can in reality really do versus the status quo.
Thank you, Commissioner, for the question. I'll try to unpack. I think there's sort of three aspects that are relevant. The first is to be clear, we don't estimate that the stock is at or approaching a conservation concern at this point. And the second is that we don't expect a rapid change in the stock in either direction across the range of harvests that I've shown. Even with the range from no harvest to far below where we are now is not going to elicit a giant response in the spawning biomass. The dynamics just move too slowly for that. And so in that regard, we're sort of stuck with this challenge of relying on the 2012 year class for the next several years, no matter what we do. We won't largely ameliorate that or make it terribly worse in the short term, in the next 1 to 2 years, until we see what's coming for additional year classes. The only counterpoint to that, I've tried to describe, is that we do have some unique circumstances this year where we are more heavily than any time in recent history relying on a single year class. And we recognize the current level of fishery performance or efficiency, not because we necessarily know what to do about that, but just it's something that doesn't fit anywhere else in our picture of the stock, and there's no reference point for that to trigger. We don't have any reference points specified that say if the fishery performance drops below a certain level, we would consider that unacceptable or acceptable. And so we just flag that for people's attention because we don't have a structure to contain that information. I guess that's the best I can do to answer your question.
Thank you.
Thanks, Richard. Peter?
Thanks again, Dr. Stewart, for your very informative, lots of information there. I kind of want to slide back to, it was a slide 16, and it had to do with weighted age. And I was curious, it's pretty clear we're relying on 2012, the 2012 year class. And you had mentioned that we were relying on the maturity rate to be somewhat in that historical range. Are you also relying on this same trend in size at age for this specific year class that looks like it's maybe positive? Are we relying that trend will continue? or, you know, what happens if it plateaus or?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I'm not sure I can get back to slide 16 right away, but it's the trend in overall historical weighted age. The short answer is that the 2012 year class in the data does appear to be tracking with that increasing size at age. So I realize that it's not, I don't have it plotted here. Well, no, it's not true. 10 years old, yes, it is plotted here. So it is the 10-year-old line, and it is in the data you can see that it is tracking. We are counting on that in the sense that we're not expecting it to go down in the next several years, but we don't, for 3 years, we don't project a trend. We just assume the same size at age that we have now. So it could actually be that it does slightly better, but the amount of change over a 2 to 3 year period will be small.
One other question, and actually it's the next slide, and it's in regards to Region 2 and specifically 2A. And I've heard it's unique in terms of migration of fish, but it's not like, let's call it Florida, where the halibut go there to reside and they retire down there. They do go back and forth within the region, and they, you know, they're not unique biologically. I understand they're the end of the, you know, they can only migrate north, really. But just a little bit of description on that. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for the question. And you know, this is an area where our understanding really has, we've broadened our understanding over even just the last decade with the advent of some new technologies. So we've now done some satellite tagging of fish in Region 2 that showed us a lot more mixing than we thought was there historically. So we satellite tagged some fish actually in Puget Sound that then during the spawning season departed Puget Sound and spawned. We had fish recovered off Vancouver Island, fish recovered off Haida Gwaii, and one fish that actually went as far north as the inside waters as high as Sitka during the spawning season. And that individual fish actually then went back to Puget Sound the following summer. So the biology is complex, but it's definitely fair to characterize these biological regions as quite linked within the calendar year, and perhaps more so than we thought before, despite the fact that these fish also seem to have some site fidelity to individual areas. So the fish might make several hundred miles of spawning migration and then return effectively to the same bank the following summer. So it's an interesting mix of effects of fishing and other things occurring on an area and affecting that area, but also affecting other areas and vice versa. I think the takeaway is that when we think about conserving the stock in terms of maintaining biomass, we have over a period of years realized that we really need to focus on maintaining biomass across all the biological regions, and that focusing on an individual regulatory area, especially with our tool of measurement being a summer survey, might lead us down the wrong path. We need to be thinking more in terms of these biological regions.
Okay, thank you very much again. And yeah, that's all for my question.
Thanks, Peter. Dr. Stewart, back on slide 26, and you don't need to go back to it, but you spoke about the changes in natural mortality that have been incorporated into the models. 2013, one model, 2014, another model, and now 2022, a third model. But I don't recall back in 2013 or 14, the changes in natural mortality in those models having the same impact on the assessment that we're now looking at in 2022. Now, maybe my memory's just faded, but I just don't recall having the sort of the same picture being presented to us about the change in the stock.
Yeah, thank you for the question. And luckily that was me in 2013. So I remember that. I can describe that. So part of what was going on there was well, let's see, a couple, step back for a second. Starting from the present and why this was such a pronounced change. We had gotten to the point where we had two models that were estimating a higher level of natural mortality and two models that had a fixed assumption of low natural mortality. And by shifting just one model, we saw a bigger change in the overall result in terms of our understanding of fishing intensity, because we went from an average value that was somewhere in the middle to an average value that was really looking like the high value had been in the past. So that this year was effectively kind of a tipping point for a 4-model assessment, where we've now shifted enough of these models to estimating natural mortality, and they're all estimating it at a high value, that we saw a lot more of our understanding on those high values. So that's why you saw such a big change this year. If we recall back to 2013 and 14, we weren't yet using a spawning potential ratio based harvest approach. We were using, at the time, the blue line, which didn't account even for all of the dead fish that were occurring. So at that time, we weren't dealing with U26 mortality explicitly at all in our mortality limits. It wasn't until several years later that we got to fully accounting for all sizes of mortality. And so I think that's partly why we didn't see it, and it's partly why we got rid of that system, because it wasn't tracking all of the sources of mortality and really trying to capture all of the effect of fishing. So I realize that's not a very clear answer, but there have been a lot of changes since 2013.
Yeah, no, that answer is very helpful to explain the difference. I guess, picking up on Richard's question too, where I think he was kind of going, was on slide 46, you had probability of decline in spawning biomass in 1 year. And if we were to fish at F43, we would have a 75% chance of it declining. Whereas if we had a reduction, we'd be looking at much more favorable outcomes in the spawning biomass. And I guess, just thinking about where this is taking us for down the road, it seems to me that we should be, considering not being too optimistic, if you will, about making decisions, or given the status of the stock and at this point in time. Yeah. So I don't know if others, commissioners, had any comment on that, but I guess I just wanted to provide some color to what I was thinking at this point. Not seeing anything, and I don't think there are any other questions. No. All right. Ian, I don't think you have any other presentation. You referenced the mortality tool, so I don't think you had anything else to say on that. Okay. Then we have time for public comment and questions.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chair. And so we have one question online from Dan Falvey, again referencing the stock status presentation just given by Dr. Stewart. So Secretary, if you could give Dan the microphone, that would be great. Thank you.
I see my microphone is turned on. Can you hear me? Can you hear me at all? Can you hear me at all?
Dan, I can see your microphone has been activated. Can you hear us at all?
My mic is green but not working. Can you hear me? Can you hear me at all? Testing 1, 2. Can you hear me at all? Yeah. Testing. Can you hear me at all?
All right. Well, that's unfortunate. Hopefully we can get Dan tomorrow and hear what his questions or comments are. Dave, did you want to give a summary of what's happening tonight and for tomorrow?
Yes, thank you very much, Chair. So this evening, we have the Canadian delegation meeting is in this room as soon as we close, and the US delegation are meeting in the Rattenbury room downstairs. That's from straight after we adjourn here until about, hopefully about 7 o'clock, and the IPHC reception is starting at 7 o'clock in the Shaughnessy Ballroom, which is just next to the Rattenbury room. So please join us for the reception, starting anywhere from 7:30, depending on how long your delegation meetings go for. We do have the Fisheries Minister from British Columbia joining us at 7:30, and the reception will be open until late, I'm sure. Tomorrow morning, we will start the meeting in the same room at 9 o'clock, and we will continue with some presentations on the biological ecosystem science research program, as well as management strategy evaluation. That's all I have, Chair. And noting that you're all going to digest the presentations from today, and in particular Dr. Stewart's, just a reminder that there are sign-up sheets outside the room on the reception desk to sign up for a public comment. We'll then take those early on tomorrow, and you'll be asked to come up and make your intervention to the commissioners. So please, just outside on the reception table. Thank you.
All right. Unless there's anything else, we're adjourned. Thanks very much.